I'm delighted to chair this session, which is on institutional landscapes and buildings, and I think builds on Professor Alwyn Purdue's keynote really well from yesterday evening, where she was speaking about the spaces and the spatial contexts for Ireland's institutional landscapes. So I'm going to introduce each speaker as they come up. They'll have 15 minutes and then we'll do Q&A together at the end as we did yesterday. So our first speaker today is Patrick Quinlan. He is an architect specialising in conservation and is currently working on the restoration of historic buildings in London. And he has a master's in urban building building conservation. The MEBC as it's known from UCD. So welcome to.
Thank you very much. Good morning, and it's lovely to see that some of you have braved the early session. For anyone who might be nursing a little hangover from Clifton House last night, I hope that perhaps a little walk through the asylum landscapes might, if not able to cure your sore head, at the very least be some way therapeutic. So, contemporary commentators were clear as to the role of landscape as a positive factor in the moral treatment of mental illness. But specific references to landscape have, so far in my experience, been relatively rare in the parliamentary inquiries and the annual inspectors' reports. However, historic maps give us plenty of evidence, and moreover, yours truly chose as part of my master's to follow in the footsteps of the inspectors of lunacy and visit each of these sites, 19 in total, around the Republic of Ireland. So, today's audience, I guess, is skilled at identifying where a written narrative either intentionally conceals or unwittingly reveals underlying truths. My task was the same, but with the landscape as my source. These 6 somewhat disparate images each convey a particular facet of the asylum landscape, but also reveal a deeper truth or insight into the history, management, philosophy, and resilience of the institution. So over the next 15 minutes, we're going to look behind each of these to discuss the story of a system whose original intent combined a very conventional commitment to containment and a radical ambition to cure. We'll see an institution that carefully cultivated and maintained a very genteel, aspirational self-image of itself, but also pragmatically cultivating its way towards self-sufficiency. So we will see a landscape which was custodial and functional, therapeutic and productive, iconographic and at times tragic. I actually have cut out the site selection bit of this because I feel it probably will be covered by other speakers later on in some shape or form, but the original paper, and if we do something later on, there is a little bit of site selection, but suffice to say, Connolly's advice was generally speaking followed, and even before, in the years before he even issued that, the sites tended to be elevated outside of town, nice eminence, etc. So for most of their existence, lunatic asylums were sealed societies, enclosed behind high walls, whose stated function was to protect the insane from the cruelties of a kind of an intolerant world, but whose lasting impact would be to convince the world that it needed to be protected from dangerous others within. It was custodial by design, surrounded by tall boundary walls, with access and egress strictly controlled by a gatekeeper in his lodge. Though in the early 19th century, when hundreds of lunatics still languished in cells at the rear of the houses of industry around the country, allowing patients free rein across a verdant, albeit enclosed parkland, was still somewhat revolutionary. And so to our first key image. The custodial imperative demanded sometimes minor feats of civil engineering as asylum holdings expanded. This first one is a footbridge over the public road in Clonmel, which is actually my hometown and home asylum. Clonmel also boasted tunnels under 2 more public roads, linked by a 500-foot sunken roadway, indicating the lengths to which were considered both necessary and reasonable to maintain security. Tantalizingly, this bridge may also have afforded the populations inside and outside the walls one of those very rare opportunities to actually lay eyes upon one another. The strength of the perception of otherness created by the boundary walls is difficult to appreciate now, more than 50 years after the momentous decision was taken to lower them, but must still not be underestimated. More pragmatically, the supply and disposal of water was a fundamental consideration on every site, and the challenge of dealing with highly concentrated populations, which, if we think about it, were almost unprecedented in any other building of the era. The limitations of working only within the resources on a given site are kind of easy for us to underestimate now in an era of universal mains, water, sewage, electricity and so forth, but again must be kind of considered as part of the challenge of originally setting up these institutions. And those challenges only grew as the populations expanded. The two water towers here I know will be familiar to Niamh, but as just an indicator of what it took to get a water supply, you don't just have the water towers, you also have a chimney, which indicated there's a boiler and a steam engine and probably a pile of coal and probably a man and a shovel. Open reservoirs or any open water features tended to be a bit more rare, understandable given the risks of the residential cohort in the asylums. And right into the 20th century, deficiency of the water supply would remain an issue. And in the rare circumstances where actually money was invested in the asylums or mental hospitals as they were by then in the later 20th century, it tends to be for the pragmatic stuff, the water supply, disposal, central heating, kitchens, laundries and all of that. And at the other end of the system, coming out the rear, is the kind of sewage arrangements, and kind of our second image on it. Prolonged seepage from defective sewers was not just unpleasant, it was at times fatal because it contaminated the ground. The very site that was chosen for its healthful properties could be contaminated by defective sewers and leading to kind of outbreaks of disease and mortality, increased mortality. Things did improve over time and solutions became more sophisticated than a simple pipe discharging into the barrow. For those of a more civil engineering bent, this might be very interesting. I don't propose to dwell too much more on the sewage pipes, other than to note in Ballinasloe a very strange situation arose. The hospital, St. Bridget's Hospital, ended up owning the treatment plant that looked after the wastewater, which a lot of the town later plugged into, and was left in the very strange position after Bridget's closed, that the HSE was running a wastewater treatment plant but not a hospital. More pretty things. The first edition Ordnance survey maps already depict Carlow, Portlaoise, Clonmel and Waterford as well-established landscapes within 5 years of their opening. Avenues curving through tree-studded parkland, boundary woodlands and walks all contrived to give the effect of miniature domains, and indeed they received the stipple known to those of you who work with the first edition Ordnance survey, which is reserved for polite landscape. Many other sources can find these beautiful town plants in particular are very illustrative in terms of showing every single tree. And that same approach carried through to asylums of the later phases, example here Kilkenny, which was the second phase of construction. The parallels with private domains are obvious, but the approach is also common to other types of charitable, voluntary and private institution erected from the later 18th century onwards, including schools, convents, monasteries, seminaries and so forth. It feels like boundary walls and gate lodges, avenues and planting provided the appropriate setting for the respectable extra-urban institute. Photography in the 19th century, much like landscaping, tended to be a hobby of the leisured and landed classes, and much photographic material from that time records big house life and lifestyles. Except that our third key image is of the other type of big house, as it's sometimes euphemistically referred to in Ireland, the Lunatic Asylum, in this case Waterford. The stylistic similarities of how this is recorded and presented are striking. I mean, we can only assume that the photographer was, key in laying out all the attendants as if they were the staff of a country house waiting for the master to arrive back up the avenue. But the photographer couldn't control what was already there from was the setting. And this is the setting that is the kind of classic, I call it iconographic image. It's a setting, I suppose, that reflects the social class not of those who used the institution, but of those who sponsored it and managed it, and maybe by whose association, bizarrely, there was some prestige attached to being, the asylum with the board of governors drawn from the local elites. And happily, this is, of all the different landscape features, this iconographic set piece of parkland still feels that people do understand the value of it, and it's the one that survives most intact on most sites around the country. And considering all of that, it then makes you think, well, the contrast with contemporary pauper institutions, which is what this still was, is actually quite striking. But asylum landscapes do share one feature in common with other pauper institutions, and that of course is the unmarked burial grounds, always located, discrete locations to the rear of these sites, and we heard a lot about these yesterday, which kind of informed my view even further, and there's a lot more nuances to this than first meet the eye. But what I had noted is that the practice of unmarked interment, while being perfectly maybe culturally normal in the 19th century, continued much later on some sites than might be appreciated. In fact, in RD, this retrospective memorial shows that the last burial actually took place there in 1995. So that's kind of what brings back to that there is still something here about it, that right into the later 20th century we're still interring people in these plots. So if the set piece of a monumental facade is the iconographic image of the asylum of the 19th century, it is possible that this may become one of, if we're not careful, one of the kind of the compelling image of the 21st century. But if you really only take away one message from all of this, it's probably this next one. It's that the provision of a landscape of leisure and pleasure for pauper lunatics, so far removed from their daily reality in mid-19th century Ireland, is the strongest indicator of the benign, therapeutic and curative intentions which underpinned the asylum system at its outset. Our fifth kind of key image is of two very intriguing looking buildings in the landscape at Grange Gorman. These are garden structures. These are built for the leisure and pleasure of the patients, the pauper patients. Being the most ephemeral of kind of buildings, garden buildings, none have survived the present day, but evidence for their existence around the country is quite plentiful. And again, think of the context. You've got to recall that in the 1830s and 40s, landscapes of leisure remained the preserve of the upper classes in their country domains or their locked and gated urban squares. Considered the first municipal park in Waterford, or they claimed the first one anyway, was completed only in 1857. And that St Stephen's Green in Dublin would not be open to the general public until, or reopened in 1880. And yet these paupers, by virtue of their mental state, were afforded amenities and a landscape on a par with their social superiors. As time went by, patients were encouraged to participate in more active sports, initially tennis and bowling, as the GAA kind of gained strength in the early 20th century. You see handball alleys around, you see the pitches, even a lot of asylums even did field GAA football teams, which points to you that there was a young and healthy, physically healthy population in there, even if they were there for reasons of mental health. Other external influences also penetrated through the walls. The institutions were never Catholic in ethos or management, but the dominance of Catholic culture in mid-20th century Ireland means that the Marian year of 1954 was marked with the erection of grottos and statues. And this is also a period in which the local authorities took notice of what are now being called mental hospitals for just about long enough to rename them after their favourite saints before proceeding to resume their previous level of disregard for these institutions. Productive landscape. So the therapeutic potential of landscape was also interpreted in more practical ways. From the outset, the holdings attached to these institutions were intensely productive, farms, walled gardens and so forth. 200 acres producing, and even at the very beginning, thousands of pounds worth of profitable produce. As by 1922, the institutions in the Free State contained over 2,700 acres, which expanded further to 6,800 in the 1950s, 1/3 of an acre per patient. Mental hospital committees were formed by now of the elected representatives clearly needed little persuasion as to the wisdom of investing in productive farmland as a way of reducing running costs, even when they couldn't be persuaded to invest in very much else. That has all kind of changed since the 1950s. The Commission's report kind of in 1966 recommended ceasing farming, and today polytunnels and glasshouses survive on just a couple of sites where they still seem to be used for occupational therapy. But if you want a reason why the institutions themselves were so slow to close, the landscape can offer a clue to that too. So aside from what the asylum farms produced, the institutions are typically the biggest single customer in the local economy. This is one of several weighbridges which survive around the country, which goods were recorded by the hundredweight and ton on the way into the institution, and it attests to the economic significance of them and explain why so many local communities were for so long averse to their closure. And you can draw your own conclusions as to the business kind of behaviour of the cute Kerry farmers as to why the asylum there needed 3 weighing machines, whereas every other county they do with 1. The landscape themselves, I'll probably talk more on my Friday, or tomorrow, Saturday slot, but the current landscape is not statutorily protected. Part of my research has been to scope exactly what's out there and visit all sites, so this is not quite legible. This is maybe a little bit more so as an extract. What are the features, what survives, what is at risk? There's quite a body of work that I'm happy to talk with anyone else about after the event. And again, finally, on the futures, I think this is something that will hold over to the Saturday afternoon slot, or for anyone who can't make it or stay around till 12 tomorrow. I'm going to put in a both overtime and shameless plug for forthcoming book, Cure, Care and Containment, which will address some of these issues. There's a couple of teasers of what will be on the futures talk on Saturday. And that concludes it. Thank you.
We'll also have time at the Q&A and the coffee to have further discussion as well. So our next speaker is one of our glorious leaders for today, Dr. Julian Almond, who's working in the historic environment unit of the civil service and finished her PhD last year under the supervision of Dr. Mark Gardner, and her paper is titled Bringing Down the Asylum Walls, Buildings and Landscapes at Byrne, Belfast, 1902 to 1930.
Thank you very much, Neve. So this carries on very nicely from Patrick's talk there, and will echo some of the things that he was saying. So during the late 19th century, the asylum project, which had begun in the early 19th century in Ireland, was reaching its peak. The number of institutionalised insane was about 2,000 in the 1820s, but well over 20,000 by 1900. And as patient numbers increased, asylum authorities were looking for better, more efficient ways to house this ever-rising population. And in addition to this, ideas about what was appropriate or therapeutic in terms of asylum buildings and environment were constantly shifting and changing. And these differences are very clearly seen in the attitude to boundaries relating to asylum buildings. So today I'm going to talk about Displacement Asylum, which was the second asylum to be built for Belfast, the main phase of construction being between 1902 and 1913, and I'm going to compare Displacement with its predecessor, the first Belfast Asylum, and with Auschwitz in Germany, which was the model for Displacement. So here we have the first asylum in Belfast, built on Grosvenor Road, on the site where the Royal Victoria Hospital was later built. This asylum was built was opened in 1829 and had started to appear very old-fashioned by the late 19th century. The main problem was huge overcrowding, but another important issue was it had these external features that were too easily associated with prisons. The windows were quite small and barred, as you can see in the photograph. The asylum was concealed from view by what were described as towering walls, and you could only get in or out by giving the password to gate attendant. The grounds were only 50 acres in extent, which was not seen as giving enough open space for the patients, who were increasingly expected to be doing varied therapeutic work outdoors. And in addition, the site, which had been built on the outskirts of Belfast, was gradually being surrounded by mills and brickworks and distilleries, which were all signs of Belfast's success, but they were sources of noise and pollution. So, as we've seen before, critical to patient recovery was thought to be their access to fresh, clean air and light, because physical and mental health were seen as almost inextricably linked in this period, and fresh air and sunshine were good for the body and therefore good for the mind. The low elevation of the old asylum was also a problem. It wasn't at a high enough elevation for the site to be well ventilated and healthy. So here we have, in 1895, the asylum authorities bought this large domain formerly belonging to a family of bankers, the Batts. The site is about 4 miles outside Belfast, and because it was a little bit further out, this meant that a large amount of land was available cheaply and in a healthy, unpolluted environment. The domain was about 300 acres in extent, but very quickly a portion of it to the west, about 65 acres, was hived off in 1900 to provide the site for what's known as the Byrne Fever Hospital. And the medical superintendent of the asylum was very unhappy about this for a number of reasons, but he talked about the loss of such a big chunk of land that should have been for the employment and recreation of asylum patients. And over the next few years, the asylum authorities set about adding to the asylum lands to redress this deficit. So they bought up all these farms to the west, or to the east, sorry. And by the 1910s, the asylum grounds were about 500 acres in extent and provided all the opportunities for outdoors work and recreation that were thought to be therapeutic at this time. So interestingly, although they could have built the new asylum in the old domain, which already had a wall around it, which you would have thought was quite handy, the asylum was in fact built on the farmland, the new farmland that they had acquired later, coloured blue, and no wall was ever built around it, although part of it at least was surrounded with a park railing, as we shall see later. However, the main reason for siting the asylum to the east of the site rather than the west was probably, in my view, that the land to the east was at a higher elevation, 50 to 60 metres higher, and therefore would have been seen as healthier. So that's a contemporary photograph shortly after it opened, and a map showing the different buildings on the site. So you can see it's quite different from what we normally expect from an asylum site, very different from Holywell or Port Rann, which were built around the same period. We have this scattered layout of villas distributed across this rural landscape. They look sort of like a suburban estate of rather well-to-do dwelling houses, and apparently no walls or fences, no connecting corridors between the buildings, kind of defeating our expectations. So we know that one of the most important influences on the design of Byrne was the Saxon Asylum of Alt-Scherbitz. This asylum near Leipzig was causing a stir at this period in the field of patient care and had become a standard stop on asylum research itineraries. Alt-Scherbitz offered some fairly unique features at the period. It put all categories of patient, including those with the most severe symptoms, together on this large agricultural site, where the vast majority, it was claimed 90%, were to be engaged in useful work, usually outdoors. And the second main feature of Alt-Scherbitz was that it had a greater degree of physical freedom than was usual in asylums at this period. And the majority of the patients, 2/3, it was said, stayed in villas with unlocked doors, and there were no walls, fences or gates around the asylum, other than in the case of a small number of villas for very severely affected patients. The third main feature was that the buildings were small scale and modelled on domestic houses, and it was thought that this gave a less intimidating and more home-like feel to the asylum accommodation. And there's a contemporary photograph of one of the villas at Alt-Scherbitz. You can see it's quite a sophisticated villa design, like a middle-class dwelling. If we compare the two layouts, if you see the layout of Alt-Scherbitz on the left, we can see that it's effectively divided into two halves. The earlier buildings in the so-called medical section at the top are arranged in a very ordered, symmetrical fashion, and the later buildings of the colony section to the south are arranged on meandering curves, men to the left, women to the right. But this has nothing to do with the topography of the site. It's a very level, in fact there's an airport behind it now, very level, relatively low-lying, has no topographical features really, just slopes very gradually down towards the river valley. At Purdisburn, the buildings are situated in very careful relation to the topography, which is not flat at all, but quite rolling and hilly. The highest ground is to the north, and the male villas are placed, you can see the topography there. The male villas, which are coloured blue, are placed just below the highest point, where they'd be sheltered from the worst of the weather, but also well ventilated. And ventilation, we will return to again, was a huge concern. Because it was associated with greater health. We can see that the hospital building, that sort of long building at the centre, is at the highest point of all the buildings, in keeping with the patients in poorest health, both mentally and physically, being housed there. We can see that the female villas are at a somewhat lower elevation than the male villas, and is that because ventilation has been made less of a priority? Perhaps it is consistent with the idea that outdoor work also seems to have been less common among female patients. Perhaps the strong association between women and the household and domestic tasks trumped this very strong belief in the period that they should be obtaining fresh air through ventilated buildings or through working outside. So, in terms of the degree of freedom of the site, we've said much was made at Auschwitz of the way the site was totally open, had no fences or walls, or very minimal ones, and no walls or fences around the site. And it was thought that this appearance of freedom actually made the patients less likely to escape, because there were no barriers to fight against or resist. And at Purdisburn, when it was originally built, there was certainly never any high wall, as was common in the older asylums and in the older Belfast Asylum. There are, however, some gateposts, we see one of them there, and a short length of railing at the entrance, which appears to be Edwardian and dates from the building of the asylum. However, the gateposts from their construction don't appear to have ever held a gate, and in later years the authorities boasted that the gates were always open. So what about the buildings themselves? Well, the villas at Auschwitz had a so-called open door policy, which meant that doors were open during the day in most of the villas, except those with the most unmanageable patients. It's not recorded whether there was an open door policy at Purdisburn, but we can see from the layout of the typical Purdisburn villa here. The building can be entered on three sides. There's a door at the rear where the pantries and coal yard are, and there are French doors through the two verandas on the west and east elevations. So this is an extremely permeable building, at least if the doors are open. What's interesting is that there's no clearly signalled, this is the front door. If a visitor were to approach this building formally, there's no single entrance which proclaims front door, because the main entrance is actually at the back of the house, and the other two entrances are what we might call garden doors through the verandas. So there are both too many doors and doors in the wrong places. Because of this multiplicity and odd positioning of entrances, though this was intended to be a domestic-style dwelling, it really fails at one of the very fundamental tests of a domestic house. It doesn't clearly answer the question, whose house is this, who's in charge, who has the right to open the door and let you in, simply by removing this clear signalling of the front door and creating this disorientation. Whether this was is intentional is unclear, but we can see that it works as a control strategy. This is a domestic-style environment for the patients, but the layout is it's laid out in such a way that the patients would have difficulty assuming control over the interior spaces. So let's compare this layout for a villa with one of the layouts at Auschwitz. Now, the most similar villa building at Auschwitz is this one on the right, for third-class males, which was a first and second-class patients paid for their accommodation. So if we ignore the coal yard and scullery in the Purdisburn plan, it's virtually identical in layout. I'll just blank those out. The differences are interesting, but I won't go into those today. I'll just talk about one of the similarities, which is that instead of all the rooms opening off a central hallway, as would usually be the case in a domestic house. The rooms open for the most part off each other. And I've been in one of these villas on a couple of occasions. I can say it's quite disorientating in terms of your expectations, again, of how a house should be laid out. And it's quite likely, again, that this is a control feature. If you look at the rooms on the right of the Byrne villa and on the left of the Auschwitz villa, you only need a couple of attendants in the centre section of the villa, and these attendants will know who's coming out of and going into all the living spaces. So we see these relatively small domestic size spaces exhibiting still a great concern with how to arrange the space in order to control and to supervise the patients. So I hope I've been able to show that although the Victorian and Edwardian asylums strongly associated in our imaginations with high walls, bars and physical restraint, in fact the ideal in the early 20th century was to minimise physical markers of restraint by reducing the appearance of boundaries, unlocking doors and creating an environment that appeared more open and free. However, the arrangement of buildings and spaces at Byrne demonstrates that subtle attempts were still being made to manipulate patient movements and limit the control they may have had over their living spaces, while at the same time showing this great concern for healthy and therapeutic environments with open space, outdoor work and ventilation. Thank you.
Gillian for that fascinating paper. Our next speaker is Dr. Arlene Cramsey from University College Dublin. Arlene is a historical geographer working in UCD and is also chair of the Oral History Network of Ireland. And her paper is entitled Life at the Edge, Geographies of Institutional Landscapes in 19th Century Ireland.
Thanks, Niamh. Thanks, Niamh. So what I am hoping to do today is kind of move away from one specific institution and have a look at the impact of the institutionalisation of the Irish landscape, which takes place through the various different institutions that this conference is focusing on, but in actually quite a short period of time in the middle of the 19th century. So trying to kind of see what the impact of all of these different things is that we're talking about on the landscape and for the lives of ordinary people. And I suppose to understand how important the 19th century changes are, we have to think a little bit about what's happening in the 18th century. And there are institutions in 18th century Ireland, but they're predominantly focused on maintaining law and order. So we've got army barracks, courthouses, jails and bridewells. But these are scattered across the country, they're not necessarily built to any uniform plans, and they're very much based on local control and controlled by local officials, rather than units of the state that are being introduced by this kind of a higher power, which means that they're variable in size and variable in the quality of their administration. And what we see is this kind of landlord-centred institutionalisation, which is, I suppose, key to 18th century urban development, much of which is driven by local landlords and to a lesser extent by the established church. So for most people in the 18th century, the state is very much an alien concept. It's not something that people interact with on a day-to-day basis or in their daily lives. And I think if we look at the early first edition Ordnance survey maps, we can get a sense of that 18th century landscape, albeit taken as a snapshot in the pre-famine period. And I'm using the example here today of Monaghan. So you can see quite a small town with very few large-scale buildings inserted. So a manageable scale, a human scale town. But with the Act of Union, we see really significant changes being introduced into the landscape. Now initially Westminster kind of goes, oh, we've got a new country to govern and we know nothing about it, and there's this kind of an immediate reaction of where are the maps, where are the details about the people, how is this country being administered at a local level. So we get this series of comprehensive government reports and commissions of inquiry into the state of conditions across Ireland, which give way to piecemeal reforms initially in the period up until the 1830s, and then wholesale dedicated reforms from the 1830s onwards, particularly from the 1830s up to the famine under the then White government. And these, I suppose, give rise to institutionalisation, but institutionalisation informed by broader concepts and discussions that are taking place, not just in Ireland, not just in the United Kingdom, but across Europe, informed by people like Bentham, Malthusian logic, laissez-faire ideologies, and of course the birth and development of Victorian moral idealism in that early 1830s period. And what we get is a series of reforms that are combined to give a really rapid institutionalisation of the Irish landscape, really from a period from about 1817 up to the famine, and then that continues at a slower speed thereafter. So what are we looking at? Well, there's some continuity from the 18th century. So we've got the continued development of the barracks networks. And these are maps that are taken from a project in UCD School of History in 18th century barrackses. The first image is the 18th century barracks, the second is the 19th century one. And what you can see is a geography of infill happening in the 19th century. So places like Donegal, suddenly if you just focus on Donegal up in the top corner there, you can see the infill of the barracks network there. You can also see, for example, introductions through the Wicklow Mountains across the Midlands. So concentrating on the spread of these institutions across the landscape. And we get the continuation of the reforms of prisons and lunatic asylums that had been started gradually in the later part of the 18th century. So we get the panopticon style county jails being introduced steadily through the early 19th century across our county towns. But we also interestingly get a shift away from landlord-dominated local control to central state-controlled bodies. And we see that probably most clearly with the introduction of the new lunatic asylums. The first dedicated asylum is the Cork Asylum, introduced in 1791. And an 1817 report on pauper lunatics bemoans the lack of proper treatment facilities for pauper lunatics and how they're simply detained in prisons. So we see this cross-institutionalisation. That 1817 report suggests that the removal of control of lunatics from local prisons to provincial centres with central state commissioners who would administer the new system. And that's implemented in the 1821 Act, not at a provincial level but at a district level. And these districts combine counties, it's not a great image, but they combine different counties into rational territorial areas. So essentially rest and control from local landlords. So for example, if you look at Armagh up at the top there, the Armagh Asylum caters for the counties in Armagh, Monaghan, Fermanagh and Cavan initially. Carlow caters to Carlow, Kildare, Wexford, and Kilkenny. So we see this kind of different territorial framework being introduced. And I don't need to dwell too long, I think, on the asylums. They've been quite well covered in the two earlier papers. But just in terms of their spread, you can see how the Cork one's introduced initially. We've got the asylum in Dublin, but then we have Armagh in 1825, Limerick 1827, Belfast and Derry in 1829, Carlow 1831, Maryborough and Ballinasloe in 1833, Waterford and Clonmel in 1835. So we're looking at a very short period in which these large institutional buildings are being placed on what are very small local urban landscapes in that period, moving away from the key cities out into smaller urban centres. And as Patrick has already illustrated this morning, these are, into the asylums particularly, are introduced as part of a wave of European healthcare reform around lunacy. These are therapeutic landscapes, and you can see it being reflected across Europe. But they're very much segregated landscapes. They're close to the town, but they're not in the town. They're separated from the local population by the high walls. The buildings are on a scale that, if you compare the scale of the Connacht Lunatic Asylum here on the side to the buildings in the town, these are not of a scale that people are familiar with. This is the state arriving in the Irish landscape very much with a bang. As Fogarty suggests, the provision of a suitable building is in fact a most essential condition to any judicious form of treatment. The treatment of the lunatic is to be accomplished not merely in, but by the asylum, which may be looked upon as a great therapeutic instrument itself, without which the efforts of the physicians could accomplish little. Now obviously that idealism disappears with overcrowding and some of the horrors that we know had taken place within those walls in a later period, but initially that was the aims and the ideals. A slightly less foreboding institution, and one we haven't really touched on very much over the conference, are the national schools, but again being introduced into the landscape at this period. as a result of the Commission of Education in 1831, introduced by the state and bringing the state as a reality to people across rural and urban Ireland. The state pays for 2/3 of the cost of the building and upkeep of these schools in return for state control. They're initially supposed to be non-denominational, but the other third is generally made up from contributions from the various religions, and you can see the impact that that has on the geography if you look around Ulster, where you can see the different religions competing for control of the national schools, leading to a massive concentration of schools, particularly in Antrim and Down. So there's 4,000 schools and 400,000 pupils by 1845. And that continues to spread again as we move through the remainder of the 19th century. And then we get the introduction of the Poor Law Unions in 1838. Now this was initially supposed to happen earlier. The first commission of inquiry into the poor in Ireland was in 1833. They took too long to respond, and the government decided that the way the report was leaning was to public works. That wasn't what they wanted institutions. George Nichols came over and said, the workhouse system, like you have in England, is a great idea, let's introduce it in Ireland. And that's what they did. And you can see the Victorian moral values dripping through the legislation. The deserving poor, only the aged, sick, infirm, and widows with 2 or more legitimate children would be entitled to relief in these institutions. And just like the asylums, there's a need for these workhouse sites to be on elevated locations for the health of the inmates. But also there's a very specific criteria that they should be segregated by walls from the rest of society. And interestingly, in the legislation it states that they shouldn't be located more than 1 mile outside of the towns. And that's a very clear indication of a very early form of social exclusion and stigma, a fear that these paupers would be stigmatised, that people wouldn't want them in their local urban centres, and therefore they have to legislate to prevent them being so far out of the towns that they're not useful to the people who need them most. So this is kind of a very preventative element in the legislation. They're built to standard domestic Gothic plans, and we've seen the images in Alwyn's keynote last night. But they're also, the standard can be really quickly picked up on the Ordnance survey maps. You can just take a bird's eye view and very quickly identify where these locations are. But this also required new Irish territories controlled by local boards that are different to the landlords. So we get the introduction of poor law unions, which ignore the pre-existing county boundaries, that circumvent the grand juries, that can take power away from those leading landed families. Townlands are the only administrative division that survive when the poor law is put together. They're grouped into electoral divisions and then into poor law unions. Based around a market town, the British government said, market towns shouldn't be any more than 20 miles apart, so we'll create poor law unions with a 10-mile radius. It'll be great. And it was in the east. And you can see, you just draw a line across here, you have these much smaller unions in the northeastern section than you have in the west. And when you get to the far west, you get the unions that are completely unmanageable in the period. And this is introduced as a way of making local property pay for local poverty, and it's very much a clear indication of the state and the landlords beginning to split. This is very much, there will be an elected element on these boards, you won't have total control as local landlords. So interesting in terms of the dynamics. And the fear in the legislation about wanting to push these out of the urban centres does indeed seem to be accurate. The image on the side there shows Tralee Town. You've just got the very edge of Tralee Town, and away off in the distance you've got the Poor Law Union Workhouse at that 1 mile boundary. The Guardians in Ballyshannon and County Donegal are offered a free site for the workhouse, and they decide that they, just to take the quote there, the Guardians are led most especially to make this remark from its consideration of the confined situation of the barracks, the expense that would attend the necessary alteration of it into a workhouse, and then crucially, and the circumstance that a majority of the inhabitants of the town are inclined to think the conversion of the barracks into a workhouse would not be beneficial to the town or the union. So there's kind of a sense of, okay, we know we need to have it, but we don't want it in this urban centre. And of course the very creation of inmates of these institutions, the fact that they're classified as paupers, makes them different from the poor that resided across the country up to that period. The institutions continue to spread through the post-famine period. With the famine, it becomes very clear the workhouse network is totally insufficient. It was never designed to be there for a crisis in the first place. But the unions in the West suffer really significantly. Now, the quality of the image isn't great. This is taken from the Atlas of the Great Irish Famine, which is too big to scan, but you can have a look at it. But these orange unions are the new divisions of the existing poor law unions into smaller, more manageable units with new workhouses introduced. The increase in numbers of lunatics across the country result in the increase in the number of asylums. And between 1845 and 1902, there's a whole slew of additional lunatic asylums introduced. So what we get are these large imposing workhouse buildings, these large imposing asylums, sitting side by side on the landscape together in urban towns that were generally quite small and manageable in scale up until that point. So what does all of this mean? What impact does it have for the landscape and for society? Well, anywhere that a workhouse was sited becomes a key centre of activity in the 19th and early 20th century. The boards of guardians, because they're elected, because they're centrally supervised by the Poor Law Commissioners, are trusted with new functions. So all new state functions through the 19th century land at the door of these boards of guardians. And as a result, these towns become key local centres that increase in importance. So we see a reworking of the framework of central places across Ireland, particularly with some county towns losing out if they haven't been given workhouse centres, and we get this disjuncture between the county towns and the larger towns across the country. So a change in importance with towns that have previously become important becoming unimportant and villages turning into major urban centres. These institutions are sited side by side on the landscape, on the outskirts of towns, in institutional rings or quarters, with the other institutions of the states, the post offices, the inland revenue barracks, the new constabulary barracks, the whole other wealth of state machinery that's introduced in that period. And generally side by side with the institutions of the Roman Catholic Church, which is also looking for new sites in that period. So it's a very quick period which alters forever the Irish landscape, but also makes the state a reality for many people. It brings them face to face with what that state looks like. To go back to the example of Monaghan, we've got our small urban centre in the pre-famine period in the 1830s, and when we look at the 1925 map, that whole northern section of the town has transformed from open space into this institutional landscape. And if I just zoom in a little bit, you can see there you've got the Monaghan District Lunatic Asylum, you've got the workhouse, you've got the infantry barracks, and the infrastructural development of the town, and you've got the constabulary barracks, all side by side, totally transforming that urban landscape. So just to finish up, there is a social impact to all of this institutionalisation, and I think it's important to consider. What we can see are institutions that very quickly become imbued with meaning and symbolism. Their very existence creates new categories in Irish society, that others inmates, that other sectors of society. And that othering is reinforced by these landscapes of segregation, the external locations outside of the towns, the boundary walls. And it impacts not just on the inmates, but how people viewed these problem groups in societies, the poor, the mentally ill, the fallen women, as we see with the Magdalene Laundries developing in a later period. We see circular institutionalisation. These are not fit to be let out in society, so people are moved from prisons to lunatic asylums to workhouses throughout their life with no hope of getting out of that circle. And it does have an influence on modern stigma and social exclusion. It's impossible to imagine that this institutionalisation of the mentally ill that survives up until 2006 with the Vision for Change report doesn't have an influence on the stigma around mental health in Ireland today. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Arlene, this is a great paper. A copy hasn't quite kicked in yet. So now we have Lynn Kelso, who is a curatorial officer at I was lucky enough to be curatorial officer here at the Public Records Office of Northern Ireland. And he has a fascination with maps, so he's been working on the IT and keeping everything running smoothly, but is also going to speak, so it's great to have
Good morning, everyone. A really enjoyable conference. And first and foremost, I would like to thank Jill and Trina for allowing me to champion the OS archive for 5 hours. Oh no, sorry, 15 minutes. Eve may have trouble. But moreover for inviting the community together here in PRONI. I think marked by the words and the images conveyed so far are the geographical threads that weave through the arguments presented by each speaker. And of course, most evident would be Lorraine's approach to prison's memory, Aoife's geographies of the claimed and the unclaimed dead, in Alwyn's eloquent words on her inner geographer, which cheered me up no end, and of course Arlene's edge of the town. The act of looking for and examining evidence for the Irish institution in the archive or across our contemporary landscape is of course a very geographical endeavour, where our exploration of the people, places and practices of the past can formulate an understanding of experience and an acknowledgement of collective memories. So I'd like to introduce the importance of maps and their creative use to the debates being explored over the 3 days. Manuscript maps held by the archive can encapsulate the strategy and experience of landscape, both of which erode over time. Ordnance survey maps allow us to examine a specific place and time and helps us explore how buildings may have been perceived in the past from a landscape point of view. So to do this, I'd like to step back from the details. We're all searching for the details, but I have a tendency to step back from those to examine our paper landscape. So I have a few observations which complement and agree with a lot of the sentiments being explored this morning, which I hope more than anything will spark some thoughts, if not a little discussion. Although the Irish, so to the Ordnance Survey of Ireland, although the Irish government retained a measure of autonomy after the Act of Union in 1801, none of its departments were directly concerned with map making, and there seems to have been a general assumption in Ireland that the Ordnance Board would produce a military map to match its work in southern England. However, the primary responsibilities of the board were seen as custodian of lands and supplier of the equipment to both the Army and the Navy. With increasing distrust over calculations of the cess or Irish civil tax, at the beginning of the 19th century, in February 1819, the Duke of Wellington, as Master General of the Ordnance, agreed to conduct a survey of Ireland. The Ordnance Board organised military forces of its own. It was these that were Ordnance Corps that would provide the officers for the survey in Ireland. So the complementary requirements for a military map and the fair administration of the cess, the Irish Ordnance Survey, led by Colonel Thomas Colby, completed the world's first large-scale survey of an entire country, that of Ireland, by 1846. Once completed, the Ordnance Survey provided a contemporary map of civil administration in Ireland, including the location and form of prisons, asylums and workhouses, particularly in provincial towns. The Ordnance Survey for Belfast reveals 2 phases of institutional building relating to poverty and social exclusion. OS maps from 1832 clearly illustrate a poor house on Clifton Street, which was opened by the Belfast Charitable Society in 1774. And secondly, the Belfast Lunatic Asylum at the junction of the Falls Road and the Grosvenor Road, which Jill referred to earlier, which was opened in 1829. By the mid-19th century, new buildings were being formed by institutions responsible for the poor and excluded. OS sheets dating to 1846 lay out a Board of Guardians complex on the Lisburn Road, including the Union Workhouse, which opened in 1841, and on the Crumlin Road, a county jail housing inmates from 1845. Belfast experienced major expansion during the 19th century, increasing from a population of 30,000 to 330,000, And much of this growth came as a result of rural people migrating into Belfast in search of employment, resulting in an increase in poverty, social exclusion and crime. And in her 2017 study, Surviving the Industrial City, Alwyn Purdue states that people moved in and out of destitution depending on the availability of and their capacity to work, and adopted a variety of strategies in order to survive. So I'd like to introduce 4 creative tensions, simple ideas, to spark some thoughts on the perceptions of the working poor in 19th century Belfast, while of course using the OS sheets produced by Ordnance survey as a visual order to evaluate the impact of institutional buildings upon their experience of landscape. So the first tension is proximity and distance. And the very idea of landscape implies separation and observation, where the gaze enters the landscape and sets buildings at a distance. Although there is an inescapable involvement between the observer and the landscape as observed, when the human gaze is in close proximity to imposing buildings, a visual order can enforce authority. And indeed, the OS sheet for Clifton Street in 1832 clearly illustrates the position of the poor house, which some have been in yesterday evening, on the edge of town, while being part of an improvement scheme associated with the laying out of Donegal Street. So the spectator will always associate seeing with knowing. So the proximity of the building with other sites of social improvement at this time, such as the Royal Hospital in Frederick Street, intertwines the power of spectacle with authority. As an enclosed landscape at the junction of 2 major roads, to Crumlin and Carrickfergus, the poor house becomes symbolic of endowment. Yet with its spatial environs, it detaches the spectator from those it was designed to help. The second tension is observation and inhabitation. Is landscape a scene one looks at, or a world one is living in? And that's the question. Does a local citizen observe or inhabit a landscape? When a building enforces people to observe intently, they have a sense of being close to it. On the 1832 OS map, the distancing represented in the position of Belfast Lunatic Asylum compared to central Belfast is very pronounced, along the lines that Arlene was speaking about earlier. Through its sheer lack of proximity to the poor of Belfast, the asylum was detached from the spectator, creating a sense of other, a sense of concealment. And on the 1846 OS map, the Board of Guardians complex on the Lisburn Road, which is here, draws the experiences of the poor and the disadvantaged closer to the spectator. So with its imposing buildings, including the Union Workhouse, there's a major core to the complex. Such a landscape was positioned for the spectator to stand back and have a detached view of the support on offer. Indeed, with the possibility of observing productive endeavour. We just have to show you one image. Indeed, the productive endeavour is the whole front of the building here, planted out with vegetables. Indeed, because the whole complex becomes a vehicle of vested interests, a message for personal endeavour. The third tension is eye and enclosure. To me, the landscape is not just the land itself, but the land as seen from a particular point of view. When a spectator cannot see beyond the perimeter wall in either direction, there's a sense of confinement or indeed freedom. The county jail exemplifies how landscape can be transformed with an enclosing wall, where the perimeter obstructs the eye and may discourage any action which result in such confinement. fourth, tension, culture, environment. Our landscape can become laden with particular cultural values and expectations. Wider attitudes relating to the virtues of work can be encoded on the OS map, such as this spatial association between the fever hospital, termed for the friendless worker, the union workhouse for the unemployed poor, and indeed the deaf and dumb asylum for the incapacitated worker or adult. At the heart of this visual order, the humiliation of unemployment is equally shared in association by the homeless, immoral, and indeed the disabled. So these important tensions, such as proximity and distance to our understanding of mapped evidence, are further demonstrated by this topographical view of Belfast, which portrays the comportment of the institutional buildings as dominant on the landscape. So here we have the Crumlin Road Jail, here we have the Poor House, we have the Asylum outside Belfast, and this is the Board of Guardians complex on the Lisburn Road. So there is therefore a strategy by means of official organisations who are establishing and maintaining their message as a present force at the edges of society. So in conclusion, the Ordnance Survey mapped the buildings and landscapes used by authorities to confine the criminal, conceal the insane, and reform the poor in Belfast. And by using creative tensions, questions around the impact of buildings upon our local landscape emerge. Was Clifton House built to house the poor or celebrate charitable endeavour? Was the Board of Guardians complex a reaction to growing labour pressures, or commentary on the benefits of hard work? And was the county jail built to confine inmates, or who did not conform to the values of society? Or was their prominence in the landscape a strategy to discourage the poor? Of course, Belfast was all of these things and much more. And just to the Ordnance Survey archive, we must consult to draw out the experiences and the material performance which is staged on the margins of the map. As I work in the archive, I'd like to finish with a question rather than an answer. I'd like to refer back to the woman and her children found sitting against the workhouse wall in Alwyn's keynote yesterday evening. And question, can the archives tell us more about her children's perceptions? And in Murphy's decisions in supporting herself and her children, quote, by taking her clothes off before ever seeking entry beyond that perimeter wall. Indeed, returning to Michelle and Alwyn's conversation, which closed yesterday evening, we do need a shared space where these various voices of the past can be heard, a public place to develop our understanding of the Irish institution. Of course, I would argue that the archive is that repository, a public museum to these competing voices. No matter how silent they may first seem, no matter whose record allows them to speak. And of course, I'll finish by saying even a line on a paper landscape can spark some thoughts. So thank you very much for listening.
Hiya, good morning, and thanks for Trina and Jill for asking me to chair this panel. I'm really excited because I think it's going to echo into a lot of what Alwyn was talking about last night with trying to get at the personal voice of those who used a lot of these institutions that we've been talking about for the last 2 days. So we're going to start with Grania Blair. Grania is an independent historian who is returning to her field of interest whilst learning to live with a permanent brain injury. She's an activist, mentor, researcher. She has contributed to many recent published works, exhibitions, and art installments, especially related to women. She has also published on Lola Montez, and her work on the Salvation Army was the first in its field, especially related to Ireland, and it continues to provide the basis for further research in the area. And Grania has said if anyone has any further questions, she would be happy to be contacted via email to help in any way she can. Okay.
Good morning.
I'm delighted to be presenting to you today. No, really I am. I know I mightn't look it, but I am. As part of a most interesting conference, and to see how far we've progressed in the last 30 years in researching such institutions, even if we're still locked out of some. But that's a whole other conference. Particular attention will be paid today on the gendered meanings of work, as defined by Catherine Booth and the female ministry, a founding principle of the Salvation Army. I'll be using their militaristic terminology and language throughout, as I mentioned some of the services provided by the wider community to them. The establishment and continuing active response to perceived needs of the communities they worked with, initially in London, was the template of the social services providing a cradle-to-grave service for those who require it, continuing to adapt and respond to perceived needs for all, adapting to each Salvation territory's specific cultural and religious needs or objections, which is why there was never a Salvation rescue home for women in Dublin or the South, only in Ulster on the island of Ireland. For those of you interested in finding out more details, I will refer you to my published work or email me. I will respond, but a little slower now. Many histories have failed to note the importance of Ireland and the Irish tie their Salvationist histories of the Salvation Army to Ireland, especially as social and political agents of change. The army was both innovative and practical, nor were they so class-bound. This was a religious organisation where the personal was political. The army was founded on Catherine Booth's innate belief that equality for women was a God-given right. Such distinct beliefs and enduring work of the army owed more to her than to anyone else. She believed that it was inferior education and not limited mental capacity that subjugated women. She published Female Ministry, Women's Right to Preach the Gospel, and publicly preached in 1860. She was recognised as the most popular preacher of her time, and her spiritual conversions were legendary. She insisted on the employment of women evangelists and their acceptance with full equality. By excluding communion, women and men performed exactly the same sacerdotal duties. Some male evangelists resigned over this. Female ministry was central to the founding principles and beliefs of Catherine, William Booth, and their 8 children who commanded Salvation territories globally. This was the focus for the development of the army initially in England, Wales and Scotland, before globally expanding to America, India, Ireland and the rest of the world. Exchanging the democratic conventions of Methodism for a Booth autocracy ensured effectiveness. The unity of the army in the early days of its rapid growth was one of its strengths. Her children Bramwell and Eva also served as generals after their father's death. Catherine had ensured a dynasty by consolidating the growth of the army through her children and their marriages in the 1880s, and so the social organisation began. Their political activity, especially in the British Isles in the 19th century, was their spearheading in 1885 with W.T. Stead, George Bernard Shaw and Josephine Butler, what became known as the Maiden Tribute agitation, as well as their legal battles and victories to parade down main roads. Such notables had met during the battles to repeal the Contagious Diseases Women's Acts from 1864, and they also succeeded in having the age of consent raised from 13 to 16. Other political activity was ethical trading, especially in their support for the match girls strike in 1888, when they set up their own match company, selling only red-tipped safety matches under the motto, "Lights in Darkest England," and offered better working hours and pay to the women. So come with me now to the East End of 19th century London, where Jack the Ripper murdered amidst pea soup fogs. Little match girls died of phossy jaw, and there was a brisk trade in hymens of young girls. The lower classes died of starvation, the cold and general lack of care, while temples to consumerism and the rising middle classes flourished, built on the backs of sweat labour, and this was not just London. It was out of a backdrop such as this blatant poverty and homelessness in the streets that the Salvation Army, as it became known in 1878, grew as an organisation out of their earlier work as the East London Christian Revival Society, later called the East London Christian Mission. Catherine threw herself into ensuring the recruitment, training and commissioning of thousands of young women who were to serve in the field. The first army training home was in London in 1880. Her daughters Emma, Eva and Lucy were in charge of the training of these young women recruits. They worked with them in the streets, in the slums and in the genteel drawing rooms, collecting souls and funding. Training was to provide 3 to 6 months of intensive immersion in practical evangelism, basic management and elementary literacy. They were then made lieutenants and sent to assist several women captains prior to their own captain's appointment in a small town or section of a city. Their ministry consisted of preaching nightly, both at open air and indoors. They conducted house-to-house visitations and raised their own living allowances from the weekly sales of the war cry. After 3 to 6 months, they were moved to another town or area, normally paired with another woman. By 1865, Catherine knew that what these women most needed was a real home, for they were homeless, and that they needed support in their first efforts to earn their own living and return to respectable society. So upon her return from Ireland in 1884, it was Florence Bramwell Booth who commanded and expanded the Army's Women's Social Services and the slum work graphically described as the Cellar, Gutter and Garret Brigade. They were totally opposed to any of their projects being run on reformatory lines, and indeed advocated laughter, fresh air, and in keeping with Catherine's beliefs, often vegetarian food. The first women's refuge opened in Whitechapel in 1884, with the first shelter beside it in 1889, which cost 2p nightly, the creche in 1890, and a metropole in 1891 for those who have risen and able to pay 4 or 6 pence for a proper bed, all located in Hanbury Street, just doors away from where Annie Chapman had been murdered. They had their own headquarters by 1887, their own specially trained officers and orders and regulations by 1892. The Deliverer, their publication, 1889, and 30 years later they had 117 homes in Britain alone, ensuring their position as the largest, most effective and perhaps most innovative rescue organisations worldwide. Such programmes, which grew out of the preserved needs of those the Army came into contact with on the streets and in the slums in which they themselves had come from or worked in. Irish women entering a receiving home throughout the Salvation Army territory availed of their shelters and metropoles, refuges, creches, children's homes, mother and baby homes, maternity hospitals, district and wet nurse supervision, addiction rehabilitation, adoption, servants' homes, eventides, training homes, employment agencies, and prison gate work, to name but a few. The men's social work, such as the food and shelter depots, commenced in 1888, and even William's Darkest England scheme wasn't until 1890. Their land and farm colonies for both men and women was assisted emigration during the decades that followed. For example, by 1926, almost 5,000 women had been placed all over Canada in 10 years. Gender and class was suspended in this new organisation. Exciting and dangerous careers beckoned for those brave enough to change their lives and practice what they preached. Women were involved in much more than charitable work. All classes, all sinners could rise from the depths of depravity to be saved and in turn become an officer in the army if they wished, and that was innovative, to say the least. Causes such as temperance, purity, and women's suffrage were not unknown in other organisations, but the army offered more. It was exciting, dangerous, a lifetime's work with no marriage bar. The fact that one could move through the ranks, even if one had been the worst sinner and less educated, did not deter the army from using them. Teenage girls and boys, often with only a few weeks' training, were sent out into the field of battle with little more than a knowledge of the Bible, a strong voice and sturdy boots. But their souls were filled with fire and blood. They had God on their side. A history of the Salvation Army in Ireland from 1880, focusing on a different role for women and men as prescribed for Irish people in that period, adds to our understanding of the overall history. Such a history also adds to the discussion on power, sexuality, gender, class and race, where none of these categories are taken as a given. The Catholic Church in Ireland was re-establishing themselves and developing their own social services. It was into this heated battle for souls that the non-denominational Salvation Army marched, initially to Belfast and Derry in 1880 and Dublin by 1881, later establishing in Enniskillen and across Ulster, Cork and Waterford. And as they say themselves, quote, "The army is confronted with peculiar difficulties in the south of Ireland in general and Dublin in particular. The newly converted, the women. The newly converted Salvationists were immediately recognisable due to the distinctive uniform of the army. The wearing of the uniform evoked horror, revulsion, violence, death, imprisonment, neutrality, war, safety, respect, admiration, and it was a constant reminder to those who wore it and those who looked at it that a different way of life existed. All young women officers were called the Hallelujah Lasses by 1879, and with their distinctive uniform and tambourines were a well-known sight, the antithesis of other unrespectable public women. In May 1880, and these are the women I'm talking about now, in May 1880, Caroline Reynolds, a veteran officer accompanied by Sister Spencer, Mary Marshall, Lieutenant Phoebe Strong and Lieutenant Polly Fish, commenced the invasion of Ireland. The first Irish Corps to be formed in Belfast and the second in Derry, Londonderry. Their arrival was eventful to say the least. They came virtually unprepared for the cultural, religious and political differences that existed in that part of the British Empire. Quote, "No one will ever know what we went through. The army colours given for Ireland had a green corner with the harp and no crown. We did not know that this was treason. Then we had orange hymn books. The Orangemen gloried in that and the Catholics were wild at it." Unquote. Their success in Belfast led to the establishment of a rescue network in Ireland. Their success in Belfast, a women's home opened in 1887 at 63 Great George Street in Belfast to cope with all Irish demands in keeping with Salvationist practice. The home was located as closely as possible to the communities they were aiming to assist. In order to offset expenses, fine sewing of linen and handkerchiefs as well as the finishing of shirts provided both cash for the homes as well as employment for the women upon leaving. By September 1889, 250 cases had been dealt with in the Belfast home, most leaving either for employment or returning to their families or friends. Officers worked in the home, got no salary, only their board or lodging. The dedication of the officers and their families is borne out time and time again, where they responded to a particular need personally. By 1901, Belfast was the Irish Provincial Army headquarters, with 14 corps, 2 societies and a demand for more. After nearly 20 years, the parent corps, Citadel, was prosperous and making substantial progress. This respect and disposition should not be that surprising considering the sectarian polarisation of the city that had developed markedly in the 19th century. Captain Annie Lockwood sailed for Ireland in 1880. She'd read enough in the newspapers to realise that Ireland was going to be difficult. Quote, "The army's motto, blood and fire, aptly described the phrase she was about to enter. This was an area described as the notorious Shankill Road, which locality visitors to Belfast will be told is the place to find good loyalists." By December 1913, the army reported 4 corps established in Dublin, as well as the men's home located in Albert Hall, Peter Street, that housed 119 men and lads. Cork and the North Pole was how Irish-born Major Cook described the opening of Cork in 1901, and went on to describe his tour of Ireland in 1902 as a baptism of blood and religious intolerance. In Ireland, there were specific problems associated with working with women in particular. This was rooted in sectarianism, and the issue of proselytism ran deep within the island and had much bearing on a contextualisation of the problems associated with the development of the army in Ireland. In the decades after the Ulster Revival, not everyone was prepared for the particular public aggressive evangelism of this new type of religion. It was particularly foreign to the re-establishing Catholic communities. Their religious meetings were noisy, lively affairs where the congregations were encouraged and expected to participate, where women preached publicly and conducted meetings. This may explain in part why they received such a hard time in Dublin, Cork, Waterford and Derry. Most of the other homes open to women in need in Ireland in the 19th and early 20th century were refuges, similar to or were Magdalen homes. Many of these were places where the women had to commit themselves for at least 2 years or until they were considered fit to return to the world, having undergone a regime of moral education and industrial training. From a total of 2,903 records for Great Britain and Ireland commencing 1886 to 1892, the 233 Irish women extracted, 131 had sought refuge on 208 occasions. 170 admissions was purely for refuge, and an additional 25 were for homelessness, emphasising the difficulties that women had in retaining accommodation and work, as well as requiring somewhere to convalesce. Respectability was ensured by a character reference and was easily destroyed by the word of superior. In direct contrast to this, the army provided Irish women with refuge, employment, friendship, education, training, lodgings, childcare, adoption, fostering, medical care, and spirituality, which was non-judgmental. During the 19th century, non-judgmental care was innovative, to say the least, and was obviously effective, as the majority of women, 16%, were recorded as staying within the rescue network for only 4 months. They then left for employment, normally gained for them by the army, and stayed in contact with the Salvationists. 82% stayed between 1 to 10 months. Only 6% were still in the rescue network after 14 months and no longer than 3 years. This latter group was made up of women who had entered the network early in a pregnancy and stayed for confinement and subsequent employment and arrangements for their child. Oh, I missed the 5 minutes, did I?
Yeah.
Oh, it's you down there.
Sorry.
Yeah. Sorry.
Sorry, I
I
just
know.
looked over when I had it up, I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay.
In conclusion, the last one, please. In conclusion, no, the relevant one. This. Yeah. In conclusion, then, the Salvationists brought a new way of implementing care for those they came in contact with. And there's the quote. And I particularly like the rollicking. And just to say, as of January the 1st, 2019, the Salvation Army currently are in 131 countries worldwide. So just back up the second one there. So they can just see, because when you see the spread of it, that one, that's it, through all the decades. So it's 131. Thank you very much.
we have Bridget Keown, who's going to talk to us about the psychological effects of the Easter Rising on female patients admitted into the Richmond Asylum. Bridget received her BA in History and Russian Literature and Language from Smith College and her MA in Imperial and Commonwealth History from King's College London. She has recently completed her PhD in World History at Northeastern University and is due to take up a lecturing position this August at the University of Pittsburgh in Gender and Science in their Women, Sexuality and Gender Studies program. Congratulations.
Thank you so much. It's a real honor to be here today. Can everyone hear me okay? Okay. The microphone thing always does me in. Okay. So I'm going to start off with just a brief story for you. On May 20th, 1916, a 44-year-old Anglican woman, whose initials were KM, was brought to Dublin's Richmond Lunatic Asylum. Her husband testified for the past 10 days that she, quote, believed her husband wanted to poison her, end quote, and refused food. Moreover, it would appear that KM had been seriously affected by the events of the Easter Rising. She and her husband had recently moved to a house approximately 500 meters away from Sackville Street and lived extremely close to the shelling that was taking place there. According to her case notes, KM was alone at the time of the rebellion, but at some point in the aftermath, her husband, quote, had threatened to put her out, further increasing her fears for her personal safety. When they attempted a physical examination of KM, doctors were surprised to see that, even in the warmth of May, she was wearing heavy underclothing, perhaps out of a persistent fear that she would have to flee her home in the way that her husband mentioned. Someone in the room, most likely an attending physician, noted conversationally that, quote, she must be smothered wearing so much clothing. To KM, who was convinced her life was under constant threat, the remark was interpreted as a threat. Her doctors had determined that the only way to treat her was to smother her. Several weeks later, it was noted by the same physician that KM, quote, became very apprehensive and excited when I spoke to her. She said, now what are you going to do to me? Don't kill me, please. She whispers to the nurse when she thinks I am not looking, is he going to smother me? End quote. Over the course of her 20-month stay in the Richmond Lunatic Asylum, KM appears to have suffered periods of severe depression and anxiety. She was described as, quote, restless, fidgets and looks around apprehensively, and also as, quote, quiet and depressed. In February 1917, she confided to her doctor that, quote, she thinks her husband excited her. He was very bad-tempered and threatened to put her out. Sometimes I think he tried to poison me. Despite her lingering fears over her doctor's intentions towards her and her fear of returning home appears to be even greater. At one point, she was reported to have asked, can't you let me stay here? Doctors, however, do not appear to have given much credence to her fears, noting that all her quotes were basically symptoms of her mental illness. Instead, she was labeled dull and unintelligent and was released in January 1918 with a note that she was now quiet. In KM's case notes, it's possible to see a number of broad themes that I wish to examine, which emerge from the study of the case notes admitted to Richmond Lunatic Asylum during the period of the Easter Rising and the subsequent First World War period. First is the fact that the Rising itself was a source of trauma for many women who were overwhelmed by its violence, by fears for their own safety. In the spring of 1916, Dublin became at once a home front and a battlefront, making it a unique site within the context of the First World War in the United Kingdom. As a result, negotiating relationships and day-to-day life proved overwhelmingly stressful for many, especially women and families with fewer financial resources on which to draw. Second is the way in which doctors interpreted women's expressions of suffering and their performance of trauma. My work as a whole considers British and Irish women's testimony and experiences of trauma as a result of their experiences during the First World War and the Easter Rising, the potential for understanding and treatment that they received for that trauma, and the ways in which their war experiences were remembered and forgotten within the context of the history they endured. By focusing on these women's testimony regarding their trauma and treatment, I hope to expand the story of women during this period by acknowledging their emotional and psychological experiences, as well as their physical, economical, and social realities. Over the 19th century and up to the opening of the First World War, an enormous amount of study and literature had been produced by medical professionals who had defined their careers by defining trauma, the appropriate reactions to trauma in men and women, and the successful courses of treatment that would effectively cure the patient. It was the First World War that shattered the foundations of that understanding, forcing medical professionals from every combatant nation to reformulate definitions of trauma in order to cope with the enormous number of soldiers who were returning from the front. The result was a reframing of trauma that continues to affect our understanding of psychological distress, especially in warfare to this day. In many cases, doctors continue to rely on pre-war theories of gendered behavior, emotional disposition, and self-control to define the symptoms and treatments of patients, only developing new tactics and theories where necessary, such cases being the waging of war, the staffing of front lines, and the achievement of ultimate victory. Those who did not contribute to these objectives were not included in studies of resiliency or theories of practice. For this very reason, when it came to descriptions and treatment for shell shock and other war-related trauma conditions, women very frequently were overlooked. As such, my paper will consider not only the effects of the rising on civilian women, but will also seek to analyze their gendered experiences within the asylum, bearing in mind the history of trauma treatment at this time. I'm going to just give you a quick background to the place of Lunatic Asylum within historic context, describing it as a site of patient care, medical power, and a representation of a specific gendered culture, and then I'll move on to consider some case notes of patients in the asylum during and after the Easter Rising, and discuss how their experiences can change or challenge our dominant historical narratives of the period. In response to the dire need for more facilities to treat patients in Dublin, monies were made available in 1810 for the construction of a public asylum to be named the Richmond Asylum after the Duke of Richmond, Lord Lieutenant of Ireland. In 1828, a tract on the state of lunatics and lunatics asylums throughout Great Britain was published by Sir Andrew Halliday, who observed that, quote, "Ireland is the only portion of the British Empire where just views have been entertained of what was necessary for the comfort and cure of her insane populations, and where these views have been fully carried into effect." The way of life in the asylum would soon change as the patient population swelled exponentially for reasons that have been already discussed in the course of this conference. Amidst extreme overcrowding, poor sanitation, and a severe strain on staff, the quality of life within the asylum grew steadily worse. In 1879, the death rate at the asylum was noted at 19% overall for patients. Although a number of superficial improvements, such as decorative wallpaper and the introduction of organized sports for men, was introduced by the end of the 19th century, as was noted yesterday, the quality of life within the asylum, both for patients and staff, deteriorated significantly as a result of the First World War. The Easter Rising represents a particularly momentous period within many hospitals in Dublin, and in the asylum especially. Caught in the midst of a war for which they were not prepared, doctors, patients, and nurses, was forced to mobilize in ways never before necessary. In Richmond, the surgical hospital attached to the asylum treated a number of civilian gunshot wounds, though it does not appear the hospital itself was pressed into military service. Nevertheless, the violence of the Rising still penetrated the walls quite literally. In a report to the Board of Commissioners, Dr. John O'Connor Donnellan, who was the resident medical superintendent, noted, quote, "It is a matter of satisfaction at being able to state that neither amongst the patients or staff was there a single casualty, nor did the building suffer in any way, although belligerents on both sides were constantly firing through the grounds. Patients were forced to put their mattresses up against the windows in order to protect the interior of the hospital, and the fighting in the area was so violent that, violent outside the hospital, that supplies of food, doctors, and potential patients were all barred from entering the hospital between April 24th and May 1st. When a ceasefire was declared, the renewed admissions to the asylum give some indication of the psychologically damaging effects of the Rising on the general population of Dublin. According to A. Collins in the Irish Journal of Psychological Medicine, between May 1st, 1916 and May 31st, there were 45 admissions to the Richmond Lunatic Asylum. The average monthly admission rate for 15 months between January and March 1916 inclusive was 26. Thus, the number of admissions in May 1916 represent a 42% increase. One of the women admitted on May 1st was a 36-year-old who was brought to admission by a British soldier and was given a diagnosis of, quote, recent melancholia due to shock. Several historical texts reference this woman and her diagnosis, noting that this shock, quote, may be the first occasion, quote, that the word shock appears as a diagnosis in the admission books of Grange Gorman, leading to the conclusion that patients appear to have been given the diagnosis if their experiences in the conflict were part of their preceding complaint. Now here, as I have mentioned, the reliance on the shock diagnosis and expectations that a gendered and poorly defined understanding of trauma is the only way to identify and legitimate the suffering of civilian and female patients, which wholly obscures the complexities of women's experiences and their subsequent interactions with doctors in the asylum. As a closer view of some of the case notes demonstrates, the varied experiences of women on the Dublin home front, their observations, memories, and fears show the emotional and psychological effects of the violence of the Rising and the Great War. For many civilians, including the women I will discuss, the change in Dublin between a battlefront and a home front was a deeply traumatic one. The level of violence employed was overwhelming, causing many women to feel absolutely out of control in spaces that they'd once considered familiar. Indeed, one woman's case notes explain all her physical, mental, and emotional symptoms simply by stating, quote, she was in the midst of the troubled area during the rebellion of 16 and felt the strain. In some cases, the Rising also caused women to question their relationships and identity as they were forced to reconsider their own positions within their community. Take, for example, the case of MR, a 46-year-old Protestant woman who was admitted in February of 1918, allegedly having been suffering from, quote, delusional insanity for the past 18 months. The supposed cause of her suffering was excitement and, quote, fright at the Sinn Féin Rising. MR spoke repeatedly during her admission about people who, quote, called her Sinn Féin and tried to make out that she was not a married one. The danger she describes was not specifically one of a physical attack, but was rather a threat to her identity within her community. MR's feelings of persecution further extended to the feeling that there were, quote, electric wires at the back of her that her persecutors would use when they wanted to attract her attention. Though modern psychologists have often described such haptic hallucinations as a presenting symptom of schizophrenia, the real significance of MR's descriptions is the way in which the electricity she described rendered her feeling helpless and at the whim of those who, quote, wanted to attract her attention. In addition to demonstrating how the events of the Easter Rising affected women, these case notes also offer insight into the experiences of women in the context of the First World War and the effects that loss, worry, fear, and grief had on them. Take for the example the admission of a woman whose initials were MK who was admitted to the asylum in March 1918. Doctors put great stock in the fact that MK reported, quote, to be temperate, but she herself says she drank heavily 2 or 3 weeks ago and that, quote, her mother was of a flighty nature. Both pieces of information pointed to a hereditary condition exacerbated by the patient's own poor habits. However, her friend who supplied the testimony at her admission also explained that her symptoms were the result of, quote, fretting about her husband, who had been in France, and nerves affected after her father's death. Her son was killed accidentally during the rebellion. Just to note, MK later told doctors that her father was killed in the Rising, making it a little confusing as to how many losses she suffered specifically when, but nevertheless it is clear that she was suffering as a result of the violent death of loved ones at home while simultaneously coping with the fear of another loved one serving in France. Upon hearing of the death of her family members, MK suffered a breakdown that was significant enough to force her neighbors to call the police. According to her notes, the news of the death, quote, upset her nerves and she did not know what she was doing. She says she has a faint recollection, goodness gracious, of breaking glass and things when she was upset and of the police coming to take her away. Later in her notes, she confided in her doctors that, quote, she was frightened of the soldiers. She thought they were coming to kill her. In MK's case notes, it is possible to see the detrimental effects of living between 2 war fronts, the smaller one in Dublin and the larger one of the Great War. MK was both the wife of a soldier in the British Army and related to at least one man killed in the course of the Easter Rising. Yet neither her affiliation with the British Army nor to Irish nationalist causes seemed to have brought her any source of comfort, resiliency, or protection from her loss, grief, and fear. In addition to negotiating British and Irish nationalist identities and violence during the war, many women were also forced to suffer physical displacement. Several case notes refer to elderly women who were brought to Dublin from London in order to avoid the dangers of the air raids there. Such displacement, however, in addition to the stressors of war, often proved extraordinarily harrowing, as it did in the case of E.D., who was brought to Richmond Asylum by her daughter in 1917. In addition to suffering the terror of German air raids in London, E.D. also endured, quote, worry and grief, first losing her husband and her only son being called up from the army and being forced to sell her home. As a result, E.D.'s daughter noted that the 47-year-old woman was suffering from a nerve storm for the last 4 weeks, but was not violent, accompanied by delusions that the Germans have her and are torturing her by cutting off her hands and taking out her eyes. She said she left things in London for someone else to see and worried her. She expressed a fear of the Germans landing. Throughout her stay, doctors noted that E.D. refused to eat, and her fears of a looming death was seen to be indication of a mounting imbalance in her mental state. However, both observations may also have been indicative of the uterine cancer from which she was suffering, which doctors refused to acknowledge until it was too late to treat her or relieve her suffering. Doctors noted on March 24th that, quote, a malignant growth could be felt, and 2 days later, E.D. passed away in the asylum. Her experiences of displacement and dislocation as a result of the war emphasizes the physical and social upheavals caused by the war that went overlooked because they did not conform to temporary notions of war trauma, the needs of the state in wartime, or the conventional methods of listening to women's pain. In conclusion, as the case notes of the Richmond Asylum show, the Easter Rising was a terrifying, traumatic event that transformed Dublin and women's lives. Their case notes attest to the fact that women suffered not only for fears of their personal safety, but those of their relations who were fighting in the streets of Dublin and on the fronts of the First World War. These stories have largely been left out of the broader history of the war because their cases were ruled as non-war related. As female civilians, most women did not fit the criteria of patients who might suffer war shock. These women who did remain the exception. However, a closer look at the experiences and testimony of women in the Richmond Asylum offers powerful proof about the destructive nature of war to both body, mind, medicine, and to history. Thank you.
Thanks, Bridget. And our final speaker is Lucy Simpson-Kilbane from the University of Liverpool, and she's going to be talking about fallen women in post-independent Ireland. And having previously studied history at the University of Leicester, Lucy completed her MA in Irish Studies at the University of Liverpool in 2013. She received the Institute of Irish Studies MA Dissertation Award for her thesis, which presented a critical analysis of the 2013 Mekinese report on state involvement with the Magdalen Laundries.
Thank you, Judy. So when I began as part of my research to really interrogate Ireland's Magdalen Laundries as part of James Smith's architecture of containment, I was struck by what seemed to be quite a significant contradiction. So this is that it appeared that unless they were admitted to the laundry on probation from court or on licence from an industrial school, the women were considered ostensibly free to leave when they wished. But many women remained institutionalised for a number of years and even for life. And the laundries are now understandably considered to have been prison-like institutions. So I'll be drawing on survivor testimony and also on the findings of the 2013 Mekinese report on state involvement with the laundry system. And this paper will seek to establish why many women remained in Ireland's 20th century laundries when they were deemed to be there in theory at least on a voluntary basis. So the laundries, the so-called fallen women, were not, of course, unique to Ireland. There were laundries and laundry-type institutions in the UK, in Europe and America, particularly in the 19th century. But this paper will focus on the 10 Catholic-run laundries in the Republic of Ireland that are addressed in the Mekinese report. So by the end of the 19th century, Ireland was home to over 40 Magdalen laundries. They were named after the biblical figure of the repentant prostitute Mary Magdalene and established variously by Protestant and Catholic lay philanthropic groups. As penance for their supposed sins, the women endured a regimented existence of work and prayer, spending long hours cleaning and drying, mending clothes in hot, uncomfortable and actually often dangerous conditions. And they were not paid for their work, rather they laboured in the laundries to earn their keep and gain their redemption. By the early 20th century, the majority of the country's Protestant and lay-run institutions had either closed or altered their function. But in the absence of a state-funded alternative, independent Ireland's Catholic-run laundries continued to operate well into the 20th century. Now, continuing a trend that was already identifiable in the late 1800s, by the beginning of the 20th century, the laundries were increasingly home to fewer prostitutes and far more unmarried mothers, as well as what were called first fall and preventative cases. So the latter consisted of supposedly bold, flighty, or feeble-minded women and girls who had not yet fallen, but who was feared or at risk of doing so. The laundries also received women who were deemed a burden on their families or society, and those considered to be promiscuous or in need of moral guidance. Crucially, it can be argued that in the reactionary climate of the 1930s, the country's Catholic laundries enjoyed something of a revival, as Irish state policy increasingly embraced and reinforced Catholic moral teaching, particularly in the area of sexual morality. So the Magdalen laundries offered a means of containing and controlling those women whose behaviour or whose potential to transgress from the dominant moral strictures was deemed to undermine Ireland's claims to moral superiority. So women admitted to the laundries in the 20th century tended to stay for longer than their 19th century counterparts. There is, however, some disagreement over how long on average the women remained in the Magdalen laundries. Now, the work of the Mekinese Commission was the first attempt to establish an average duration of stay. The Commission concluded that between 1922 and 1996, over 11,000 women entered these 10 laundries. And they calculated that 61% of these women were institutionalised actually for less than 1 year. So this suggests that the women actually enjoyed relatively free movement. But, as the Mekinese report itself acknowledges, duration of stay was unrecorded for 45% of the women. So this figure of 61% is actually, in light of this fact, of little value. Furthermore, the Commission's findings may have been distorted by the fact that for a number of women for whom data was available, point of entry is given as from another laundry. So the Mekinese Commission chose not to carry the length of any previous stays over, but rather they began counting again when a woman entered another laundry. So for example, if she spent 1 year in one laundry before going to another, that would be counted as 2 stays of 1 year each, and this would reduce the average length of stay. So having crunched the numbers, Catherine O'Donnell of Survivor Group Justice for Magdalenes, JFM, concluded that the average stay was in fact 3.2 years, and this number is far more in line with survivor testimony. The Commission's findings also revealed that of the women and girls who made up the increasingly heterogeneous populations of these institutions, only a small number could be deemed to have been officially detained. So some girls, as I said, stayed in the laundries during their period of post-discharge supervision from an industrial or a reformatory school, and women found guilty of a criminal offence could be put in the laundries while on probation, also alongside others found guilty of infanticide. But during the period under investigation, only 622 laundry residents, or 5.6%, were listed as having transferred from an industrial or a reform school, while 646, or 5.8%, were admitted via the criminal justice system. Now, route of entry is listed as unknown for 28% of the women, so both of these numbers could potentially be higher. Nevertheless, the remaining, and therefore the majority of women, were deemed to have entered by themselves, again we'll question that, or were admitted variously by their family, by their local priest, by Ireland's Health and Social Services, or from a charitable or another charitable organisation. So these women were, in theory, if rarely in practice, considered free to leave when they wished, as actually were those admitted via the courts or from the industrial schools once they had served their probation period. So this raises 2 really important questions. Why did so many Magdalen women remain in the laundries for extended periods, and how far were the laundries prison-like institutions? Now, when they were established in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, it was intended that the laundries would offer refuge to women and girls otherwise friendless and hopeless. In his description of Hyde Park Laundry in Dublin from 1897, a Dominican father explained that one would form a very false notion of the laundry, were one to expect to find barred doors, small narrow spiked windows, or anything approaching to the semblance of a prison. Almost 60 years later, in 1956, the Sisters of Mercy similarly reassured the British doctor and author Halliday Sutherland that the girls entering the institution were, in fact, free. Now, this response is, of course, understandable from members of the Catholic Church, but it was also reflected in the testimony of a survivor of a resident of St Mary's Stanhope Street in Dublin. Kathleen Legg, who entered the laundry in the 1950s, noted that the door to the outside was never locked. We could have walked out of the gates easily if we had wanted to. But others who entered the laundries in the 20th century described instead their devastation as the laundry door was locked behind them. And for many, admission to a Magdalen laundry was, quote, much the same as being sentenced to a prison. Now, a very common grievance of the women who shared their testimony with the Mekinese Commission was that there was a complete lack of information about why they had been admitted to the laundry and how long they were required to stay. This, alongside the fact that they were placed in there with many older women, led to a very real fear that they would remain in the Magdalen laundry for the rest of their lives. As one witness explained, "No one ever spoke while I was there. In our heads, all we could think of was we are going to die here." Another witness described how it was devastating to hear the door locked and I was never to walk out. When that door was locked, my life ended. So this therefore suggests that many women remained in the laundries as for many months and often years as they were simply unaware of their right to leave. Witness testimony reveals furthermore that the actions of the Irish police in returning supposed escapees to the laundries created among the residents this impression that they had been imprisoned. Many of the Magdalen women feared that the Gardaí were waiting to capture them should they attempt to leave. Now, following the examination of various Garda reports, the Mekinese report concluded that under certain circumstances the Irish police were permitted to arrest and return to the laundries women and girls who left without permission. But again, this was specifically those from the industrial schools and others who were serving court-mandated probations. A retired Garda confirmed that the women were only ever brought back to the Magdalen laundries if a court order was in existence for their detention or residency there. However, in evidence that they presented to the Mekinese Commission, JFM said that the police arrested and returned to the Magdalen laundries anyone who attempted to leave without the nuns' consent, regardless of the original reason for their referral. Now, this practice was not confined to one laundry or to one region, and it was known to have happened across Independent Ireland. Crucially, even when such arrests were justified under Irish law, it is likely that they appeared arbitrary to the women in the laundry, so this cultivated this prison-like and punitive nature of the Magdalen laundry system. Former residents explained to JFM, for example, that witnessing the arrest of escapees and the punishment that they received on their return scared the life out of them, ensuring that many were simply too frightened to ask to be released. For the system's advocates, however, it was the nuns' wholesome influence and their use of mild persuasion that helped to maintain the laundry populations. Witnesses to the Mekinese Commission recalled how they made repeated requests to leave, but were persuaded by the nuns to stay as they would not be able to cope in the big bad world outside. The laundry managers were often keen to highlight cases where the women had been allowed to leave, only to return the same night ringing the bell begging to be readmitted. And I've recently begun work on the wonderful material collected by the UCD Magdalen Oral History Project, and this so far does seem to support this idea. One witness explained, for example, that she frequently informed the nuns that she wished to leave the Good Shepherd laundry in Cork, but she was encouraged instead to become a child of Mary, which would allow her to assume an elevated position in the laundry. She was told this process would take at least 6 months, and it was necessary to build her character before she could leave. She did eventually leave over 5 years after being admitted after going on hunger strike. Now, there was, of course, a financial incentive for the nuns to retain the Magdalen women for as long as possible, thus maintaining their workforce. But there was perhaps some truth to the nuns' assertion that the Magdalen women would struggle outside the laundry, as they received in the laundries little in the way of education or training that would help them to secure employment once they left. Furthermore, as a result of the stigma attached to the laundries and to the women who were believed the women who were there was many cases little prospect of them returning to their families. Keen to avoid a public scandal, many sought to distance themselves from their females' objectionable behaviour. As one woman explained, the parents of unmarried mothers in particular wouldn't have them home again as they had disgraced them. But it proved really important for the laundry residents to maintain contact with their families if they were hoping to leave the laundries. The nuns of the Galway laundry informed Sutherland, for example, that if the Magdalen women wished to leave, they must have a suitable place to go, and would preferably be collected by a parent or another family member capable of providing for them. Now, some women did leave the laundries once the nuns found employment for them elsewhere, but survivors' testimony suggests that it was widely believed among the laundry residents that they must be collected by a family member. As a former resident explained to JFM, it was a well-known fact that once you went into the Magdalen laundry, you never came out. Unless a family member of yours took you out or somebody claimed you, then that was the only way, or else you'd go out in a coffin. But regardless of the reason for their admission, the women discovered that ties to their former lives were largely severed upon entering the laundries, as the women were isolated from society and separated from their friends and their families. Now, although visits from relatives were not prohibited, they were restricted and conducted under supervision. For example, one woman said that on the rare occasion her mother did come to visit her, they were never allowed more than 10 minutes or so together, and there would always be a nun hovering. And letters sent and received by the Laundry residents were also checked and censored. So consequently, many women remained in the Laundries for a number of months, even years, waiting to be rescued by a family member that they may have had little or no contact with since their admission. Many others, such as those transferred to the Laundries from orphanages or industrial schools, remained institutionalised because they believed they had no family and therefore nowhere else to go. Although the Magdalene women were encouraged to perceive the nuns as surrogate mothers, many of the Laundry residents described suffering significant emotional and psychological abuse in the Laundries. In their testimony to the Mekinese Commission, they recalled being belittled and taunted by some, though not all, of the nuns, who sought to persuade the fallen women that their families no longer wished to be associated with them. So this understandably had a demoralising effect on the Laundry residents, who explained how the treatment they received led them to believe that they were worthless and had nothing to offer a prospective partner or an employer. Marina Gambold, who spent 3 years in the Magdalene Laundry in the 1950s, explained, "The longer I stayed in the laundry, the more I felt the nuns were right. Maybe I was less than nothing." So uncertain of their rights, or fearful of the life that they would lead without the support of their family or wider society, many of the Magdalene women subsequently became acclimatised to institutional life and to the routines of the laundry. They were referred to as girls regardless of their age, and the women were provided with plain and shapeless uniforms and were expected to adhere to a strict timetable of work and prayer while under constant supervision. So as a result, the women could be seen to have been infantilised, forfeiting control of all aspects of their lives to the laundry managers. And in time, as Legg reflected, the laundry residents became so passive that they believed their lives in the laundries were normal and consequently did not seek to leave. And this suggests a form of mental as well as physical containment. So from the 1960s, in the wake of Vatican II, and as the financial viability of the laundry work diminished, Ireland's Magdalene laundries generally relaxed their regimes, with many remaining open as refuges while closing their laundries or selling the laundry elements. John Kennedy observed improvements in the 1960s. John Kennedy saw his manager from the 1970s at Whitechapel Laundry. And he said that the pity was that when the good days came and the Magdalene women got their freedoms and they were allowed to go out in the world, very few took the opportunity because they were institutionalised and they didn't have the qualifications or the social skills or the courage to go out there. So when reflecting on the recent history of the laundries, it's perhaps all too easy to lay blame for the system and solely at the feet of the Catholic Church and the nuns who operated the institutions, but state and society must also be held to account. The laundry residents were rejected by their families and by a society preoccupied with maintaining a particularly Irish brand of moral purity. As Mary Costello observed in 1897, there is not in all the world a boycott so remorseless as the boycotts of the Irish lower classes when one of their kind falls away from virtue. And this observation, I think, remained valid well into the 20th century. So consequently, many vulnerable women had little choice but to seek relief in these institutions when they found a home when all other doors had been closed against them. Thank you.
Everyone, I'd like to welcome you to session 8 here, Institutions of Confinement and Care, Ideal and Reality. But I would just like to contend at this late stage that our panel should be renamed the Limerick Soviet because all of our speakers are associated in some shape or form with the University of Limerick. So our first comrade to take the scaffold here this morning is Coleman Dennehy. And Coleman is a criminologist and historian in the University of Limerick. He's a former Marie Curie scholar who has previously taught in both the University of London and the University of Vienna. His new book, he assures me, Parliament in Ireland, 1613 to 1618, The Evolution of a Colonial Institution, was published last month, so congratulations on that, Coleman. And a second work, Law and Revolution in 17th Century Ireland, will be published over the summer by the Irish Legal History Society, which Coleman is a counsellor. So his paper, The House of Correction in 17th Century Ireland, looks at rogues, vagabonds, sturdy beggars, and idle and lewd and idle persons. So I think he summed us up exactly. The floor is yours, Coleman.
Thank you very much. So this paper may come across somewhat disjointed because I left the original at home. So this is a paper, a reconstructed paper that seeks to reconstruct the history of this somewhat sort of penal institution, but also a sort of a very early version of a kind of a social engineering project in a way. I was feeling a bit of a fraud because the material I work on is the 17th century and it's so much earlier than most of the other papers here. But I suspect if you're willing to bear with me that it might be that a lot of the themes that are coming up should be very familiar with you, and I'm not so sort of vain as to say it all starts with this sort of project, but this is one of the earlier ideas about how you deal with deserving poor, idle poor, people who don't fit into what social engineers demand from people living in poverty in their society and behave in the manner that they want, whether it's men or women or class or whatever else. So on the 18th of April 1635, royal assent was given to an act for the erecting of houses of correction and for the punishment of rogues, vagabonds, sturdy beggars, and other lewd and idle persons. Now, whereas the idea of punishment of what we might call these days social welfare and societal views on poverty may well be different now to what they were in the 17th century, I think these three issues intersected then too. Although the early history of these institutions are difficult to fully understand, for the early modernists' usual complaint or sometimes excuse of the lack of institutional records, and I realised yesterday and earlier today why I tend to stay away from 20th century and 19th century conferences for the sort of jealous rage that builds in me when people put up PowerPoints listing all the wonderful sources that they have and they're scrabbling with 2 pages worth of an act and a sort of an act of imagination. But I think there is a possibility at least to construct or reconstruct at least a sort of a skeletal history of how this might have worked, or at least the aspirations of those who drew up the legislation may have wanted to do. So working both, like I say, from this aforementioned act and other kind of comparative or amending legislation, one can build an idea of the setup for these institutions, and adding to this occasional references in urban and other records and the limited records of sentencing in the criminal courts, a partial history of the development and the use of these houses of corrections can be traced. So this paper has tried to, an initial discussion of this, where this may lead us. I've signed a contract to write an early modern kind of crime and punishment book, so I'm sort of, it's a few years off yet, but I'm just trying to tease out how to build a history like this when source material is so different from what a similar book for the 19th or the 20th century might be. So the Bridewell is the first, as was mentioned yesterday, is the first example of one that we have in London. It's a former royal palace. It's given aside, it's one of a number of big prominent institutions in late medieval and early modern London dealing with the poor. A lot of them are hospitals, and it comes about, I think, as probably as no surprise with the decimation of the monastic system in Ireland, where a lot of these institutions will have been provided for by monasticism, and these are sold and the lands are done away with. There's a sort of a kind of a hole in provision for kind of welfare for people of various sorts, various kinds, and they're not delineated as strictly as they might be in the later modern period between poverty and crime. They intersect a lot more. In reality, I suppose they do in the modern period as well. We do have one in Dublin as well. It's called the Bridewell, number 13 on the map, just here. That's Strinners for Winners there, and Dublin Castle here. So I'm not sure exactly where that institution sits. I'm not sure anybody does. I figured out from the map it may not be accurate. Somewhere maybe around the Stag's Head or Dame Lane or somewhere like that. It works pretty much on the same basis as the English House does, as far as we know. It's a Tudor institution, and it's basically there to clear the streets of the poor, and particularly those who, the kind of division between the genuine unfortunates in society and the sort of idle people who won't work, the deserving as opposed to the lazy. You put people to work inside the institution, and from there you try to improve. I think it's taken in the sense of the sort of humanist tradition of early modern Europe, particularly a lot of Protestants who would have been on the continent during the Marian exile come back with strong ideas about sort of setting up, maybe not quite a utopian society, but thinking about problems in society and trying to build institutions to deal with what they see as the problems of society. And certainly the poor are one of those as well. It's clearly an urban institution, and I think it's primarily to deal with an urban environment. I think it's raises a lot of concerns about issues, particularly in disease and things like that as they come into the city. They're so much more virulent within an urban atmosphere. Remember, Dublin is a medieval city at this point. People are living very closely together. I think there's issues around morals, particularly sort of divine issues about those who would take alms, who are capable of work, and they come in for particular criticism, and also issues pertaining to sort of idleness, and also things like morality and sexual morality and things like that. There has been a lot of work done on these houses in England, not so much that I can find, at least in Ireland, in the 16th or the 17th centuries, and on the European ones as well. That's Hogarth's view. You can see there the pillory up high, very painful position to have your hands in at the back, and the kind of inspirational quotes like working in Google, better to work than to stand thug. That's an 18th century impression. I don't know how accurate the picture is. I don't know if Hogarth actually was inside the Bridewell or something like that. The 60s and 70s interpretations of the houses of correction and the ideas behind them rely on a sort of a strong kind of a socialist or Marxist interpretation about the capture of labour and poverty and the growth of industry and kind of capturing a workforce inside a system. I think it probably doesn't work for Ireland. I'm not sure it really works at all, to be quite honest. I think there's a danger that perhaps they kind of went with the theory first and then tried to build the facts around that idea. I mean, it may work for other ones. Also ideas about that they developed first in Northern Europe in places like Amsterdam and in Germany, at times where they're saying these are the most prolific, well, perhaps for the early stages of capitalism, but certainly we've got huge cities in Southern Europe that don't have them in places, and very prosperous ones as well, where I'm sure poverty comes into these ideas. I think as well, if you're talking about the law and things like masterless men, we're about 200 years too late after the Black Death, the breakdown of serfdom, and particularly using legislation to establish what exactly is the relationship between wage regulation and like I say, people moving away from the village, away from their masters amongst the upper classes. It's clearly a class issue. I don't think there's any doubt about that, but I think it's also about petty crime, around societal control, around the disorderly poor, around riots and things like that, and around idleness. There's a very fine PhD in the university over at Queen's by P.D. Fitzgerald. To the best of my knowledge, it's not been published in any way. I think it was probably Mary O'Dowd was the supervisor of it. I think he works in the museum down in County Tyrone. I've never been in touch, but it's a superb read. He deals with the legislation quite a bit. He suggests that it's almost exactly the same as the English legislation. I'd suggest it's probably a little bit different. If you permit me, I'll just run you through very quickly. I'll give you an idea. This is where it goes through Parliament. It goes through the House of Commons first, it's read and it's committed. But if you look at the dates that it's getting its first and second reading, 16th of April, 16th of April, 17th of April, and this is done in batches of about 10 other acts, so it's very clear that whilst they're reading the legislation, it's not getting a rigorous kind of committal. It's the same back in the Commons, then no committal, no committal. Royal assent the following day, 3 days to get your legislation through, that's the way you can do it. And like I say, 10 other acts are done in that batch, and 2 weeks previous we get another 10 acts going through. And there's a whole swathe of legislation goes through in this period that deals specifically with social issues, everything from bigamy to usury to buggery to houses of correction. And there is a sense that there's programmatic governors coming from England saying, you know, part of this colonising project about improving Ireland and civilising Ireland, and this sort of legislation is being used too. Now, whether you can use an English institution and plant it into somewhere like Ireland and expect it to work in the same way, when early modern Ireland has got considerable differences around religion, around language, around society, around the way class works, it's not always going to be exactly the same. The legislation itself, like I say, many similarities to the 1611 Act, but not an exact replication. One house to be built in each county, which means you should, in the 17th century, have 32 houses built. Built very quickly within about a year and a half by Michaelmas, 1636. The raising of money to be built in the locality, and this is the Bridewell, had been built both in London and the Dublin ones, around the local kind of well-to-do population using their money to build it. Seeing as I don't think it's just a charitable idea, I think it's as much as investing in crime control and in the sort of deviant population. A fit person to be governor, obviously this is a very powerful position. You'll keep an eye out that they can put people to work, which is part of the idea, but also to fetter them. These are leg irons. Whether all people in there are in leg irons all the time, I don't know. I suspect they're probably not. Moderate whipping, whatever that means. And to give allowances to rogues as they shall deserve by their own labour. So there is an income for those who are being put to work. Exactly how that process works, oh dear, 5 minutes. I'm not entirely sure. The other issues we can work down, but the actual definitions of rogues, I'll just give it to you very quickly from the legislation. The first one is worrying for those of us on kind of runnable contracts in the university sector. All persons calling themselves scholars going about begging, or idle persons going about in any country either begging or using a subtle craft or unlawful games or plays, or feigning themselves to have knowledge in physiognomy, palmistry, that's reading palms, or other likely crafty sciences, or pretending that they can tell destinies, fortunes, or any other like fantastical imaginations. All persons that be or utter themselves to be proctors, procurers, patent gatherers, or collectors for jails, prisons, hospitals, all fencers, bear wands, common players or interludes or minstrels, wandering about, all jugglers, wandering persons and common labourers, all persons able in body, using loitering and refusing to work for such reasonable wages as is taxed and commonly given in such parts, for such persons do or shall happen to abide or dwell, not having living otherwise to maintain themselves, all persons delivered out of jails that beg for their fees or otherwise travail begging, all such as shall wander about pretending lost by fire or otherwise so fake charity, all such as wandering pretending themselves to be Egyptians or wandering in the habit, form or attire of counterfeit Egyptians shall be taken and judged and deemed rogues, vaudevillains or straight beggars. The Egyptians, I'm nearly certain, is Roma gypsy. It's the term that's being used at the time, which goes into the historic idea of people who are reading palms and that sort of thing. Look, all of these, just to really cut on my time, I think it says a lot about the worries of the othering of society. People who live in the town, you know your own neighbours, it's fear of the outsider coming in, either whether it's bringing disease, extracting money out, who you can trust, our own poor are our own, but those coming from abroad as such, by which I mean the rest of the country, is a big issue. The worries about the sturdy beggar, the undeserving poor, the people who can work but won't. All legislation like this, I would argue, is aspirational. I think that's very clear. Limited town records that we have would suggest that it's difficult to build these quickly. Even a very prosperous old town like Clonmel, for instance, Breed McGrath has done the books on Clonmel. They're still 3 years after this act, when they should have been fined for not having built their house, they're still talking about how they're going to build it. The first reference I have to a governor being appointed is 1644, which is 8 years later, and Clonmel is dripping in cash in the 1630s. They have lots of money. So if you're trying to build one in new counties, where you're just building planter towns like, say, Fermanagh or Tyrone or Donegal, I expect it takes a lot longer to do so. The problem with these, the difficulties that we don't have for these institutions with our source material that I would love to think about, is the rate of incarceration. How many people are actually being put in? It's not just true judges appointing people nearly there, but also around people just clearing. There's provisions, for instance, in the Act to just do a clearance of the county twice a year. All the local constables are to inquire into their local area. Where are your lazy people? Where are your poor people? Can we get them in? Is it being run for profit? You know, what is the role of the governor? Are they taking huge amounts of money out of that system? Is it a genuine for-profit operation or not? What is the gender balance of people going in? Is there gender segregation within the houses? I'd suggest there's probably not, judging by the layouts that we can see. Is that a big deal in early modern Ireland? It might be, it might not be. English commentators always make suggestions about the lewdness of Irish women in this period, and whether that's just the outsider looking in and not understanding Irish society or Irish women. What's the rates of escape? Corporal punishment and discipline, how often is this moderate whipping being used? Whether it's just a run-of-the-mill thing, or is it just a punishment for those who step out of line? All of these things are very difficult to say. I just have a handful of court records where people do end up. We have very few court records. In Kilkenny, in the 1660s, William Morrison and Roger Hennessy were plucking cherries from the Duke of Ormond's orchard. I don't have a sentence because the piece of paper is ripped where the manuscript was written. Got into awful trouble once for presenting a paper called Taking the Duke of Ormond's Cherry. In Tipperary, Thomas Murphy, Until the Next Disease, that's 6 months later for a common assault. Catherine Brown, Stealing Sheep, 3 months in the House of Correction. It's usually men who are stealing animals in Restoration Tipperary, yeah. Andrew Sexton, Until the Next Disease, 6 months for calling the Queen a whore. Andrew Langton and Edmund Wades, 3 months for stealing Holland smocks, that's your kind of blanket you wear, and perverts that they were a pair of drawers. Tipperary people for you. John Burke, 3 months, theft of silver trinkets. So it's just, like I say, just a general introduction to what this can be. There's always the chance more records show up, but I think for the book that I'm trying to write, at least a bit of a chapter on the role of this incarceration project, and that it's partially prison, it's partially social engineering, it's partially just about dealing with kind of poverty crimes, and also the well-to-do people kind of looking at the poor people within their society and deciding what level of support or punishment they need. So that's it.
I'd just like to thank Coleman for that really quick but very informative run through 17th century Ireland, and we hope that we will be hearing more in the very near future. Now, our next speaker is here at huge expense by great popular demand. She is currently our very talented and gifted organiser of the conference, but she is also the student representative on the Irish Association of Professional Historians Committee, and she also puts in tremendous work organising the Irish History Students Association of Ireland. She is the co-editor of the History Studies Journal, which is the Journal of the History Department of the University of Limerick, which is a publication of renown, as I can testify to myself. She is recently has been awarded the Royal College of Physicians Ireland Kilpatrick History of Medicine's Research Award for 2018. She also contributes greatly to the teaching and learning as a department assistant in the Department of History of the University of Limerick in Mary I. And in her spare time, she is undertaking her PhD with the great Sarah Ann Buckley and the eminent Dr. Maura Cronin, looking and focusing on the history of Irish insanity and asylandom, on concentrating, I suppose, on Limerick District Lunatic Asylum, which later became St. Joseph's Psychiatric Hospital, and her research is funded by Mary Immaculate College sponsorship. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome the great Trina Waters
Victoria, that was ridiculous. I know it's the best tenor when
Like saying I was unprepared.
I'll pay you later. Okay. I'm very conscious of time, and I don't want to be the hypocrite of going over your time because I've been horrible to anyone. I'm sorry. So I'll just dive straight in. So yeah, as Victoria said, my doctorate research predominantly focuses on the Limerick District Lunatic Asylum, today known as St. Joseph's Psychiatric Hospital. I'll obviously be referring to it as today as the Lunatic Asylum because my work largely centres on its 19th and 20th century history. Now what I want to do today is just show you a small window into what kind of information I'm getting out of those archives. And it's with that I hope I can relate to you why that information is important and why these sources and their preservation are equally so. Because as you all know, and for all of us who are working within institutional histories as exhibited today and yesterday and tomorrow again, their preservation really truly is so significant. Because the study of history, it's not just learning about the past, it's very much learning about the present. It tells us how we got here today. And in this instance, with mental health being so topical, we need to know of this history. So it's for that reason I'm bringing in the Mental Health Commissioner's report into this discussion. That's
St. Joseph's on the Limerick Asylum, sorry. So Mental Health Commissioners report into this discussion, and I just want to draw your attention here to the PowerPoint and introduce to you a report on Unit 5B of University Hospital Limerick from an inspection conducted in August 2017. Now this report was published on the 1st of March 2018. For anyone interested in it, it's available there on the website. Now the leading complaints included patient restraint, methods of treatment, conditions and overcrowding. 3 children were admitted and housed here between 2016 and 2017. However, this is an acute adult-focused psychiatric unit, and quoting the report, this centre did not provide age-appropriate facilities. It was also in its 3rd consecutive year of being in breach of legislation concerning consent to treatment under the Mental Health Act of 2001 concerning ECT, electroconvulsive therapy. Now, quoting the report, there was no evidence that a discussion about the treatment took place with the resident or patient and where appropriate the next of kin. Gender sensitivity was also not being demonstrated in both staffing and patient treatment procedure, and the conditions here were also considered unclean. Poor ventilation meant offensive odours smelling strongly of sewage were present. There was remnants of cigarette butts and burns found in many of the rooms, and there was also a lacking of patient privacy due to the inadequate bedroom screening, as well as the non-portable office telephone. Also, the communal TV lounge was being used as a bedroom. Now, concerning physical restraint, the unit was also found to be non-compliant with its regulations, where 1 patient was restrained not by a member of medical staff, but actually by a security guard. So despite the acknowledged best efforts of staffing here at University Hospital, and in particular in Unit 5B, the report deemed this unit in 2017 as unacceptable. Now, interestingly and worryingly, the key issues and complaints that feature in this report on Unit 5B are very much the same within the Limerick District Lunatic Asylum history. So today this paper is going to consider the report above. Now, it'll obviously not be a comparative work, that would be an unrealistic assessment, but rather I'm going to take one key issue from the report being overcrowding. And what this paper is going to do, it will assess if overcrowding features in the history of the Limerick District Lunatic Asylum in the 1800s, and if so, why it happened, and then how it was dealt with. So just to offer a brief history of the Limerick District Lunatic Asylum, it opened in January 1827. It was the 2nd District Lunatic Asylum established under the then newly repealed Lunacy Ireland Act of 1821, and it was to serve not only Limerick City and County, but also the districts of Clare and Kerry. Now, it was established with bedding for 150 patients, and this was to cater solely for those who were considered lunatic but curable. So advertisements in local newspapers were sent out for its opening, stating that this asylum would afford accommodation for poor objects, male and female, from the counties of Limerick, Clare and Kerry, as well as from the city and liberties of Limerick. It is right to state that this institution is not authorised to receive idiots or epileptic patients. However, as I'm sure many members of this audience will be well aware, practice can often be quite different from policy, and health policy in particular. So, as was the case in many of these larger asylums, 150 beds were simply not enough to serve all 4 of the proposed districts. So very soon after opening, the asylum was accepting both curable and incurable patients, embracing nearly every variety and phase of insanity, and each and all demanding increasing attention. And that's a quote from one of the minute books. So basic housing of the incurable soon took precedence over the care of the curable, and in turn frequent excessive overcrowding became destructive to what would have been considered the asylum's original good intentions. Again, another quote. So the weighty demands made of this establishment were not unique in Ireland, and as stated, available evidence suggests Limerick shared many features in common with other asylums across the country. And indeed, looking at the Carlow Asylum, that was full 2 years after opening in May 1832, as found by Catherine Cox in Negotiating Insanity in the southeast of Ireland. So for concerning Limerick, those governing the asylum soon found themselves combating against an ever-growing inpatient populace. And what's more, the ratio of incurables to those curable was very soon sizable. So in January 1848, the Inspector of Lunatic Asylums at the time, Francis White, devoted 3 days to the entire inspection. And as you can see here from the graph, 165 out of 165 male patients, only 16 were considered curable. Now that's 9% of the male inpatient population.
26 were considered doubtful and 18 probable. And for women then, out of 163 female patients, including one case being sent home on trial, only 10 were reckoned curable, 24 doubtful and 18 curable, or 18 probably curable. So again, this was not an isolated reality within asylum-dom, and again was similarly found by Cox in the Carlow Asylum. In 1842, 102 out of 169 patients were considered incurable. So we can already see that those governing the asylum were struggling with admittances, and in particular the extensive levels of incurable patients. So this part of the paper is now going to consider why this happened. And in order to do that, I'd like to take you into the late 19th century Irish asylum through the experience of one male patient. I'll name him Michael. And he was a patient in the asylum in the 1870s. Now, while I have unusually rich records from Michael's case, his admittance was in no way unusual in the late 19th century asylum. But it's actually thanks to Charles Darwin, which is mind-boggling, that I have this case, and it was he who preserved this case in particular in his own private archives, and I was very fortunate to have gotten them. Like many families in the 21st century, Michael's admittance to institutional care was simply due to the fact that his mother was struggling to meet his needs, especially with 4 younger children to care for. Her husband, Michael's father, actually died of insanity, as did his paternal grandfather. So regarding the extent of Michael's illness, it was written in his case files that he suffered frequent epileptic fits and had decreased in frequency as he grew older. He was incapable of speaking except a curious humming sound, and he seldom moved far at a time, and when disturbed, he would occasionally become very vicious, butting those about him with his head, which was his constant weapon of offence, and with which he had a great power. Now, due to his illness, his mother actually stated in one of the letters that his habits were such that no servant would remain. So at the urging of a local parish priest, he was admitted and diagnosed with idiocy and epilepsy in the early 1870s. So Dr. Edward Messier Courtenay was a resident medical superintendent here at the Limerick Asylum during this time, and he was in charge of Michael's case. And it was actually he who took Michael's case records and sent them to Darwin. Included was a letter, Michael's case files, as well as a series of photographs of Michael. Now, the case files detailed the extent of Michael's illnesses, but also exhibited the extent of his needs. Quote, "He remains constantly in the prone position. When lifted up, he immediately lies back down. When placed on a chair, he will at once slip back to the ground. His mode of progression consists usually on his hands and knees, or with the upper extremities slightly raised from the ground." Now, according to the letter, Dr. Courtenay wrote that Michael was to evince only the symptoms of the lowest form of animal life. He showed no desire but for food, for which he had a constant craving. He had no idea of attending to the cause of nature. Courtenay could not also elicit from Michael's mother if he'd shown any sexual desires, but he did note that he always drank from the nearest pool of rainwater by dipping his head into it. So therefore, it is apparent that Michael's needs demanded care and time, and his mother was evidently struggling to meet them. There was no other establishment at the time in the borough that could cater for him, least one that she could afford. So Michael's circumstance, as stated, was not an isolated reality for many families of these districts, but this one case alone can offer a rare insight into some of the necessitous families of 19th century Ireland concerning their reliance on establishments such as this. So while this case is inherently atypical in that I have extensive records of his experiences within the asylum system, his case is nonetheless instructive. And it's for this that here perhaps we have a why such a demand was made of the asylum, particularly concerning those deemed incurable but harmless or dangerous. Now, this part of the paper is going to consider how such demands were dealt with, and although Michael's case features the asylum roughly 5 decades after opening, similar cases were actually being brought through the asylum's revolving doors very soon after opening, but on a larger scale rather than originally anticipated. So even as you can see here from the graph, with the creation of extra bedding, despite these expansions, overcrowding remained quite problematic throughout the asylum's career even. But for the asylum governors and its first moral manager, John Jackson, they directed themselves in intertwining the issues of overcrowding with the high levels of incurable patients. So 13 asylum governors, as well as the renowned lunacy reformer MP Thomas Spring Rice, met with the asylum RMS at the time, who would have been Dr. O'Callaghan, in September 1829. And that's again just to show how early this issue was. If this is 1829, the asylum is just after opening in 1827. Now, quoting the minutes of this meeting, it was simply decided to, quote, apply some remedy to that daily growing evil of which this board has long complained, the increasing number of incurables. So a large-scale discharge regime was thusly conducted, but with the focus on harmless incurables. So the next of kin of these persons were contacted to withdraw them from the establishment, and in accordance with this endeavour, a new committee was created. Manager Jackson was also directed to not receive any future patients unless absolutely necessary, and indeed the application of one patient named Catherine, whose malady appears to have been 13 years standing and is probably incurable, was rejected at this meeting. Now, this procedure obviously became an immediate issue for families across the district, and it was met with mixed outcomes. In Limerick, one mother was called in and examined, and she said there was no possibility for her to support her incurable son John if he were to be discharged. As a solution, I was able to track his records, and his release date was extended by less than a handful of weeks, and he was actually discharged in December 1829. Now, where families of incurable patients were uncontactable or simply not replying, the governors were left with very little other options. So incurables were either transferred to neighbouring institutions or left to spend the remaining days within the asylum, as found in the case of one female patient, Margaret, who was, quote, accordingly continued in the establishment when the board are equally satisfied of the inability of her relatives to provide for her. Now, the continued high levels of overcrowding, in harmony with the flaws found of the attempted removal of harmless idiots, meant that the governors had to consider another angle. So the attention then was directed to the cured or nearly cured patients who had retained their inpatient status because their families could not or would not take responsibility for their care. So where families were no longer active agents to these persons' outcome, friends and members of the clergy were contacted. One female patient, Mary, was actually withdrawn by her friends when she contacted them in 1829, in October in particular, and they accepted full responsibility for her care. Another female patient, Ellen, contacted a reverend, a Mr. Rowan of Tralee, but no reply was received. Other cured cases were simply discharged with monetary funds, but without a guaranteed source of care or protection outside the asylum. As found in October 1832, Manager Jackson considered one female patient sufficiently recovered, and although he could not state or make out if she had any friends, she was still forwarded by steam vessel to Kilrush, and she was also given 10 shillings to provide for herself, quote, until she obtains some friendly protection. Another patient, Mary, was discharged with her fare to Croom paid for, which was 5 shillings also given to her, and again, quote, beside lest she may incur any additional expenses. Now, such peculiar ad hoc releases suggest the pressures felt by those governing here concerning the acute levels of overcrowding. Now, with this discharge regime in practice, and just to offer an insight into patient turnover levels, by 1843, 1,594 patients were provided with moral care at the time. 867 were discharged. That's 54%. So the remainder were either deceased or still receiving care. Now, this meant that over half of the inmate population over a period of 16 years were admitted, treated and released. But note that not all those that were released were cured, as exhibited from some of the cases here, and that figure doesn't also include the numbers who would have been readmitted. So, although there were evidently attempts to remedy overcrowding, this issue was to largely remain throughout its career, and again, as found in August 1894, both the female and male wards were 75 people over capacity. Now, this insight of battling overcrowding suggests that the Limerick District Asylum, like many of its kind, became an essential need for necessity to families of 19th century Ireland. And this is why the Mental Health Report of 2017 is so interesting. Both the Limerick Lunatic Asylum and Unit 5B of the University Hospital Limerick were and are endeavouring in that similar vein of providing some form of mental health care. But with the TV lounge being used as a bedroom in Unit 5B, it's clear that overcrowding remains subject for complaint in this field now, just as much as it did nearly 2 centuries ago. So to conclude, today's paper is based on ongoing research, and it must be stated that there are many categories that can affect the narrative of patient classification and outcomes, including the Dangerous Lunatic Act of 1838, a piece of legislation that was to become highly dangerous in itself, as suitably put by Una Walsh. For today, comparing the cases of those considered curable and incurable may offer just a little sight into the experiences not met by those admitted into the 19th century district asylum. And constructing this history is very much predicated, however, on the preservation of these sources that help us understand the dynamics of asylumdom and institutions alike. And therefore it has to be stated that those saving, cleaning and preserving such valuable records do astonishing and vital work. And it's for this I'd like to personally commend the incredible work of the Darwin Correspondence Project team who have managed to save such an important record, being Michael's case. And as exhibited in many of the papers presented at this event, and those that I'm sure will be later, it remains pivotal that we stay being invested in the preservation of institutional records. Thank you.
So, Mila Breakus, Trina, for that fascinating insight into St. Joseph's Psychiatric Hospital and the challenges that were posed there in keeping the institution going. Our final speaker is, but by no means the least speaker, Rita McCarthy. If you'd like to come up and join us, Rita. Rita holds an MA from the University of Limerick, and in her MA study she looked at local government and the provision of care and shelter after the creation of the new Irish Free State. She has a background in adult education and community development, and she has worked as a historical researcher on a number of radio documentaries. She's currently an independent researcher, and she is looking at, in her paper, From Workhouse to Mother and Baby Home, a County Clare institution, which is looking very interestingly at the care that was provided to vulnerable women and children in the early formative years of the Free State. So it's over to you, Rita. Thank you.
Hello everyone. The first Dáil sat on the 21st of January 2019. That was the first day Dáil Éireann sat. And one of their stated aspirations was the closure of the workhouse system and the disbandment of the Poor Law Union. These workhouses were of course much criticised, but of course this was a government on the run and they really couldn't do a whole lot at that point in time. But working with rebel county councils throughout the country, they put in place, or they tried to put in place a change, something that would change in the near future. And surprisingly, by the time they did take power in December 1922, they had in fact come up with some ideas. The provision of shelter and relief was still a necessity, and they had to, as I said, come up with a way of doing that. Now, each county council was tasked with finding its own way, which was an interesting approach to it. In this presentation, I will look at Clare County Council, how they went about the process, and how that affected the poor and vulnerable of the county, and in particular, unmarried mothers and their children. This process that County Clare came up with was called the County Clare Amalgamation. And I look at how it affected, as I said, the lives of the people that were involved with it, and in particular the women and children. And I'll also, at the end, if I have time, talk about one case, which was the case of Anne and Mary Sherlock. Now, the County Clare proposal was debated for a long time by Clare County councillors, who were a rebel county as well, who were not at that point in time receiving funding from the local government boards, the previous funders. So money was obviously a big issue in this. They decided to come up with what was called the County Clare Amalgamation. And that meant the closure of the eight workhouses and the setting up of what was then called a county central home, but these later became known as the county homes. So this county central home was in Ennis, and it was for the old, what was described as the old and infirm, a home assistance programme for those who were inadmissible to that, and the boarding out of all children between the ages of 6 and 12. Now, prior to that, the ages of 10 was the boarding out age from the workhouses in Clare. It also came up with this unusually, and there was one similar institution in Ireland, in Dublin, but the setting up of a mother and baby home, which would also be centralised in County Clare, and this would be in Kilrush. Now this was quite a political move really, because as was touched on earlier, the workhouses provided employment, and they also provided business. People had to provide milk, to provide transport, so there were businesses in each town working closely with the workhouses. So Kilrush was a town it was one of the two major urban urban parts of the county, the other being Ennis. It was a place of high unemployment and a lot of difficulties with regards to the workhouse and the laneways, and a lot of problems with regard to housing as well. So there was need of some economy in the town. So this was a political move really to come up with the idea of this. So they set up the mother and baby home, which was from then on known as the County Clare Nursery. Now the County Clare Nursery was for all unmarried pregnant women. They were to come into Kilrush. So again, it was the centralising of the services. So if the old and the feeble were centralised in Ennis, then the other problem part of the population, the unmarried mothers and their children, were to be centralised in Kilrush, which, as I said, needed the economy. Now the cost of the ratepayer was 4 shillings in the pound, and this was really what was debated in the county council meetings. Who was going to pay for this? 4 shillings in the pound was considered a very high rate for healthcare in the county. And as well as the problems of anyone paying it, in particular the towns that, the better off parts of the county, really objected to paying for towns like Ennisdiamond and Kilrush, which had bigger problems. The problem then became, I skipped a page there, sorry. So it was done for political reasons. Anyway, as soon as the treaty was signed, the whole thing came into process very quick. On the 14th of December, Michael Byrne, who was the chairperson or chairman then, of Clare County Council, wrote to all the boards of guardians advising that they be disbanded and that the new system be put in place. They responded very quickly. For instance, Kilrush wrote back on the 14th of December acceding to all requests and saying that the workhouse would be closed, the mother and baby home set up, and the infirm and the feeble sent to the county home, or as it was called, the county central home in Ennis. Now there was 118 people who had to be moved from Kilrush to Ennis, and that was a distance of 27 miles. And again, the debate with councillors about the Urban District Council and the Board of Guardians was how this could be done cost effectively. And the feeling was that by sending them by motor car, as it was referred to, was too expensive. So they wanted them moved by train, but a lot of them were in stretchers. So eventually compassion prevailed and they did move them by car. They also had to move their bedding. So this will, I suppose, give you an indication of the problems the new state was facing financially. They couldn't afford to buy new beds for them in this facility, or it was Ennis workhouses where they were being moved to, now called the county home. But they had to bring their bedding with them as well, and that was a problem for the town. So the problem then was, how would the inmates respond? And really, we have very little knowledge of what their voice was. But really, there were 118 people moved, some of them on stretchers. The Clare Champion on the 7th of January reported that the poor inmates are complaining, and I have it here on the slide somewhere. Seem to have lost it. But basically, I'll read it for you. The poor inmates are bitterly complaining against their removal far away from their kith and kin, who probably they will never see again. And that was on the Clare Champion on the 7th of January. Now that was not an idle complaint, because 27 miles was a long distance. And these were the poorest people in society, so it's very unlikely their relatives were able to travel to Ennis to see them. And it also meant the likelihood of being buried in a pauper's grave. And the pauper's grave really was a fear, a huge fear for people at that time. Now the system in the workhouse had been, they would contact people before the relatives, before somebody died, and they could then maybe take them home to die, or as often happened, take them out afterwards, and they would be then buried in the family grave. Now the family grave might not have had a headstone, but at least it was the family grave, it wasn't the pauper's grave, which really was what they feared. Now I haven't got time to talk about the home assistance or the boarding out programme here, that's a whole conference in itself really. But the other major part was the mother and baby home, and that was set up also in January 1922. Now interestingly they set up, and you'll see it there, a County Clare Nursery Subcommittee to kind of oversee that. And that was made up of 10 members. There were 2 priests in it and 10 urban and what had been Board of Guardian really, or rural district councils. But there were also an insistence that 2 ladies, as it was said, be part of that committee, and that was unusual and a fairly progressive move, I think, for its time. But unfortunately that didn't last very long, and by 1928 it was an all-male committee. Now the committee had a lot to do with the day-to-day running of the nursery, and reports would come into the committee from the matron and so on. But really the mother and baby home was controlled by Dáil Éireann, the Department of Local Government and Health, and also by Clare County Council, and both of those organisations had a lot of control over it. And I'll give you one example of that. The orders would go through to Clare County Council, they would then go through to this department, and the department would reply as to what could be done. So in 1927, the medical officer for Kilrush, Dr. Coonahan, received an order from the department, and it said, regards the dietary scale of inmates in County Clare Nursery, that the allowances of bread, potatoes and butter in the amended scale are substantially in excess of those indicated in the department scale, and the ministry sees no adequate reason for such increased allowances. Now Dr. Coonahan had previously raised the rations, requesting it through Clare County Council, and he had raised the rations, and basically he had raised it because of the high infant death rate in the facility. Now the mother and baby home, what's happened there? The mother and baby home was staffed mainly by 4 nuns who were nursing staff, and that was in 1922. Now this again caused debate at the time, because the County Council and I presume the department, although the notes were from the orders were from the council, they questioned the nursing qualifications of the nuns, and this would cause to and fro, back and forward quite a bit. And there was a kind of a subtext that they didn't particularly want the nuns there at that point. So eventually in 1928 the nuns left, and then it was taken over, the running of the mother and baby home or the nursery was by lay staff. And you can see on that slide how much they were paid, whether they were considered outdoor or indoor as well. The women themselves were the young, pregnant, unmarried women and their children. Now, their families could not or did not want to keep them at this point in time. They were expected to work as whilst they were there in the district hospital. In 1922, the first committee meeting debated how long the women could be kept, and it was said that nothing could be specified at that point in time. And they felt that if they put down a set time, then the women wouldn't come in, and they did want them to come into that facility to centralise it. So what happened in 1924, that changed. And at that point then they brought in that the women would have to stay 2 years with to stay with their babies and also to work in the mother and baby home. Now that did allow for them to nurse their children, which was required of them as well. There were a lot of, I suppose, conflicts and strange when you're reading the memos. In some occasions the women were considered to be insubordinate to the matron and to the doctors. There was a lot of memos with regards to that and how they would be dealt with. And sometimes they would refuse to work, which was interesting. and it just goes to show that they had a little bit of autonomy. They came across often as feisty women. One point blank refused to work in the district hospital, and she was sent to the county home. Now that was interesting. The county home was seen as a form of punishment, but unfortunately the county home had no room. So she was sent on the first day, and that night she was sent back. So I don't know how they dealt with that afterwards. There was also issues of fighting amongst themselves. And if you think about it, the problem with, and I know I'm short on time, but the problem with this facility was it was a disgrace from day one. The county, the first report done on it was done by a government inspector in December 1922. And in December 1922, the place had no running water, no sanitation, a leaky roof, and he said at that point in time, if there was an outbreak of fever, then this place would be, the Clare County Council would be held responsible. There were in total 330 babies baptised from the facility. I don't know how many were born because I didn't get that record, but there were 330 baptised, which would give a good indication. And I suppose I should say that facility, it was on the first slide, that was over 10 years, 1922 to 1932. The death record I couldn't find either, but what I did find was the census record, and that related to illegitimate children born in institutions in that period, who died between the ages of 0 and 2 years, basically. And of that, there was 168 children born in institutions in County Clare who died. So if you look at the two figures, they cannot be compared, they're not the same figures, but it gives an indication as to the high death rate. There were constantly doctors' reports. In 1926, a matron's report said there were 164 people in the facility, women and children, and the death rate was extremely high. Children were sleeping two to a bed. And in 1927, a measles outbreak caused a huge number of deaths again, the numbers weren't given, but it just kept saying about the numbers that had died. Now, to finish up, it closed in 1932, but in 1930, 5 women were sent to Bessborough from Kilrush. Bessborough was in Cork. This was the beginning of the big centralised Catholic-run institutions such as Bessborough, Tuam, Roscrea, and there was another one which has just escaped me. But eventually the councillors decided that they couldn't afford to keep this facility going. It came down to pound, shillings and pence. The county engineer said it would cost £30 to put water into it, and it would cost 141 to open another part of it, which would make it habitable. So the decision was based on pound, shillings and pence. And the ultimate final decision was made on 24 shillings to keep a woman and a child in Kilrush for a week. And Roscrea, which was the Shanross Abbey in Roscrea, all of these places became well known afterwards or in recent years, but Shanross Abbey could take them for 21 shillings. Now the problem with Shanross Abbey, it wouldn't take, or any of these facilities, these Catholic-run facilities, it wouldn't take repeat offenders or second offenders, as they were referred to. So one of the councillors wanted these women to be sent to the Magdalen Laundry in Limerick, these repeat offenders. But the women themselves refused to go. And this does show that there was some autonomy. The county clerk, Mr. Kelly, spoke to the women, and he came back and said, these women are refusing to go to that Magdalen Laundry. They were discharged, but their children were sent to Roscrea. And that was the end of it. I know I wanted to talk about one person, and so if you give me 1 minute. Yeah. I suppose I'd like to dedicate this presentation to two named people who came into the public record, and that was Anne and Mary Sherlock. Now, Anne Sherlock gave birth to Mary on the 9th of February 1926, and she was baptised the following day. On the 26th of March, in the early hours of that morning, the facility was, by the witness accounts of the time, freezing cold, and Anne took Mary into the bed with her. And unfortunately, she fed Mary in bed, and unfortunately, she fell asleep, and she rolled over, and Mary died. Now, an inquest was held, and no blame was laid. A lot of the nurses and the other women, which again was one of the few times I saw the voices of the other women in the newspaper reports, said that Mary had loved the child dearly and that she was heartbroken the child had died. But unfortunately, the sergeant of the guards who was there at the time insisted that a murder case be given. Now, be taken against Anne. Yeah, Anne. So Anne was charged with murder, but no witnesses came forward and there was no record of the case. Now, I did come across Anne's name again. She was working in the county home in 1927, and I'd like to think that she had a reasonable life afterwards, or some life anyway. But thank you, and I'm sorry that I've overran.
And just to echo my thanks of other speakers to Trina and to Gillian for organising such an important and interesting conference. And it's been brilliant to meet so many of my fellow Limerick researchers here as well, so that's been great. We should all meet up again at home. I'm going to speak about the exhibition project of the World Within Walls project that was carried out between late 2013 and early 2015. The World Within Walls project was put out for tender by the HSE and was bid for and delivered by STAR, an Irish public history company, which was founded as a UCD campus company in 2013. So the exhibition formed part of a larger history project which was based at St Davenant's campus in Monaghan town. This campus was first used as a site for the provision of healthcare services in 1869 when the Cavan and Monaghan District Lunatic Asylum was opened. The name was then changed to Monaghan Mental Hospital in 1924 and again to St Davenant's Hospital in 1954. The hospital stopped taking admissions in 2011 and the HSE currently uses several of the buildings on site for the provision of local healthcare services and for storage. And while some of the buildings on site do remain in use, others are in quite a dilapidated condition, including the RMS house, for example. And this project, which was funded by the HSE, included a book on the history of the site, an archive scoping project and management plan, an oral history gathering project, and the production of an exhibition on the history of the site in collaboration with Monaghan County Museum, and that's what I'll focus on today. I have the booklet from the exhibition with me if anyone wants to see that at the lunch break. I will say that I think that the project was it's not a model example of this type of work. It was a very interesting example, but having gone through the process of delivering all of that, I think it needed a lot more time and a lot more resourcing. So in many ways, I suppose I'm presenting this as a case study to learn from. And I think, you know, looking back on it, I think that while it was very interesting, we were very lucky to have the support of Monaghan County Museum in particular, to take on something of this scope and to really do it justice. I think would have required maybe a 3-year lead-in before the outputs, for example. But you know, that's part of the learning of the project. So the World Within Walls. That's just the delivery team. Dr. Anne McClellan was the medical historian working on the project. I was working on the curatorial aspect and some of the architectural history. Dr. Fiona Byrne was centrally involved in the arts management, oral history aspects, and Adele Vernock was leading up on the archive scoping project and liaising with the National Archives in particular. So the World Within Walls project is one of several recent projects that reflect the changing status of many of these large-scale building complexes. On a national level, these projects include the transfer of archives from Grange Gorman to the National Archives, the creation of the online portal exploring its history, and an exhibition project, which many of you might know, by visual artist Alan Coonahan, based on the personal effects remaining on site. Further projects include the development of a photographic exhibition around the former asylum and mental hospital in Limerick, and also Alison Lowry's project that's currently in the National Museum of Ireland at the moment. These projects have been necessitated by the closure of institutions or by radical changes of use. And in this, these Irish examples follow the pattern identified by Catherine Colburn around institutional histories and collections, and what she calls the phenomenon of collecting in the wake of deinstitutionalisation. As she argues, psychiatric collections also represent historical rupture and change brought about through the processes of institutional closures. And these public projects also reflect an increased public interest in these histories and I think crucially, institutional interests in creating and maintaining specific narratives around the sites and their meanings. So I suppose that's just to say that the collections that emerge and that are emerging at the moment are not neutral or natural in terms of what's collected and maintained, but they do reflect the desire to create a specific kind of institutional memory around these particular buildings. And international examples include the Remembering Goodna, A Closed World, the asylum system in Victoria, 1848 to 1920, at the University of Melbourne in 1998-99, and Out of Mind, Out of Sight exhibition curated by Lillian Hankel at Claremont Museum in 1999, as well as The Lives They Left Behind, Suitcases from a State Hospital Attic, based on the suitcases of personal effects found at the former Willard Psychiatric Centre in New York State. And just to say as well that the fact that the HSE funded and maintained a strong steering committee presence throughout the World Within Walls project must be considered as a central factor in shaping all of the outcomes of the project. The relationship that existed between the team of independent historians, curators and arts managers commissioned to deliver the project and this institutional body did have an important bearing on the overall project as it was delivered. We were extremely fortunate to partner with Monaghan County Museum in the delivery of the exhibition, as this gave us access to their whole exhibition infrastructure, as well as to a space that was trusted and used regularly by the local community. And I think that this trusted space where people knew that it was a space that they were going into that they felt had cared for their stories appropriately in the past and would do so again in future. I think that that strong institutional affiliation and relationship in terms of bringing these stories into the public realm is really valuable, and I think that that can't be overestimated, particularly when there's a strong element of public consultation in the delivery and the development of the whole project. So, as Dolly McKinnon and Catherine Colburn have argued, histories of psychiatry have, broadly speaking, drawn heavily upon textual materials such as the extensive archival remains of institutional medical cultures of the 19th century in the form of patient notes. And while text-based research, both primary and secondary, within archives and libraries, did form an essential backbone for the overall World Within Walls project, the narratives presented within the exhibition were primarily communicated via objects and supported through the reproduction of images and text on information panels. And I think that this object-centered approach of the exhibition is obviously informed by its museum context. That's why you're set up for the display of objects, but it also reflects curatorial decisions around the representation of patient and staff experience. In order to avoid reinforcing stigma or reinforcing divisions between staff and patient experience within the Monaghan Asylum and Hospital Complex, and to better reflect their shared work and life on site, the exhibition was organised according to themes encompassing broader human experiences. So rather than presenting two different narratives of patient or service user and that of the staff member, we decided to actually group them together and to present around aspects of life on site that would have been shared. So if a visitor walked around the exhibition space, they would have encountered stations that explored building St. Agnes, the world of work, which was participated in by both groups, illness and recovery, again something experienced by both groups at different times, and daily life, the daily life routine that was shared. We wanted to convey a sense of the institutional nature of the site, and particularly the endless repetition of closed doors and corridors, which we used through including the doors as dividers, but also through a video walkthrough of the site that people could view as part of the exhibition. And I think it's important to say we wanted to avoid reinforcing existing stigma by creating two separate narratives, but we also wanted to avoid obscuring the real differences in power, agency and autonomy experienced by the two groups in relation to the site. So we were trying to hold those two things together at all times. So the consideration of shared spaces and of collecting stories and objects that related to the shared spaces within the site actually had the impact of highlighting the importance of ideas such as status and power in regulating that environment, as well as creating greater clarity around specific roles and issues such as who was paid for their work and who wasn't paid for their work. So when you're looking at work together, you're able to look at how that experience was actually differentiated by the people who were engaging it, as well as job mobility or autonomy in terms of the work that was carried out. And the juxtaposition of material objects creating this narrative, such as, sorry, that's just more images from the site. Such as, for example, typical juxtaposing staff uniforms and typical patient uniforms in the tight physical space of the exhibition reinforced this. Also, these are the staff uniforms. Also, the juxtaposition of powerful items, such as the whistle, which would have been used to enforce order and to produce discipline, in relation to objects which rendered others powerless, such as committal forms, emphasise the importance of objects in regulating the environment of the asylum or the hospital. And many of these insights were strengthened by the conversations that we had with visitors to the museum, some of who knew stories of the site from living in the town, and many of whom had worked on the site, or whole families of people who had worked on the site through generations. And the development of these narrative points through the juxtaposition of the objects created space for conversations that added an important layer to the understanding of the subject. And I think in terms of the exhibition in general, the display of objects was one element, but really, and this is another reason why working with a space like a local authority museum and Monaghan County Museum in particular, it is an open space that allows people access that. So there was an ongoing, continuous conversation really throughout the whole project, that the local authority museum acted as a central point for all of that conversation and gathering. And Fiona in particular was really skilled at leading arts events which just allowed people the opportunity to sit down and talk while doing something else, but about talking about the shared memories and histories of the site. So the objects displayed were integral to communicating the overall narrative of the exhibition. Items that could not be displayed were also reproduced on the wall text panels, as well as reproductions of maps, plans and photographs. Our selection of objects was obviously influenced by what we could feasibly take from the site, and what was in a safe condition to exhibit, and what would reflect the history that we were trying to communicate. So key items included a bed, a large wooden table from the laundry. We had to ensure that we didn't use any identifying photographs of patients or service users, while we also tried to communicate a sense of the personal experience of the site and of the different types of treatment. And some objects were really powerful in terms of communicating a sense of a very kind of close sense of experience. So this is a lace collar, for example, that was made by one of the service users and given to a staff member as a wedding present. So something like that is an incredible object that was kept by that staff member and brought to the exhibition. So again, the act of creating the exhibition also facilitated people bringing a lot of objects to us in order to demonstrate, and the stories that came with the objects, as well as the fact that they had actually decided to keep those, is a very, very interesting story in and of itself. Other things, for example, included people brought their nursing certificates, their exam papers, their medals, as well as objects that they had kept, such as keys. A lot of people had kept things like keys. They kept some documentation from the site. So these are the different objects that people had actually kept themselves as part of personal collection making. Other objects that were kept included these tin storage boxes from the 1920s that people would have used to keep their rations for the week. So these were again the kinds of objects that people had kept themselves. And a lot of this was also about the intergenerational staff experience. So this very much related to the fact that whole kind of generations of families were working together. This is very much part of their experience. We did find, and I think there's a huge finding and a huge amount of work to be done around this, staff members' experience and how they narrated their own sense of connection to the history of the institution. That was something that was overwhelmingly evident to us. They were the community that came forward very much in terms of wanting to shape the narrative of the exhibition. And while that was obviously very important, we had to work to make sure that we had time and space to include to include other voices. I think we didn't have the time to build up the trust networks, whereas we did have some oral history stories that we were able to include. It would take time to address that adequately, I think, and to address that ethically. But we did include those where possible. Where we were able to include a sense of the personal was through personal effects, which were kept in brown envelopes in the archives section of the site, and these were objects that would have been taken from patients when they were admitted, and usually it meant that individuals had died on site if they hadn't been returned to them. So these are very, very physical objects that many people will be familiar with, like wedding rings, like glasses, holy medals, rosary beads, things like that. And they were among I suppose they were the objects in the exhibition that allowed people a very, very close sense of connection. Even though you don't have the voice of the person, you're able to represent an individual, I think, in a very interesting and powerful way through the inclusion of objects like this. Are we finished? Okay, great.
Hello everyone, thank you for having me. Thank you again to the conference organisers and to my fellow speakers. It's been a really fascinating day so far. So this is an update of the situation of the prison buildings in Armagh. Some of you, especially those in the north, may be familiar with, and a critique of the proposals, which again some of you may be familiar with, which basically an English property development company has secured recently all the statutory consents required to turn one of Northern Ireland's most infamous prisons associated with the Troubles into a luxury hotel and spa. So this is the place itself. And I'm just going to stick to the script for time purposes. Armagh Jail has existed in various forms for nearly a quarter of a millennium, and during that time has been associated with or actively participated in some of those heinous acts perpetrated on this island. It is most commonly associated with its place in the narrative of the Northern Irish Troubles, being one of the province's main prisons during that period. And the challenges posed by this association with 30 years of sectarian violence render the site a particularly challenging heritage asset in the present. But this paper will contend that Armagh Jail has always been what Logan and Reeves have called a place of pain and shame, ever since its founding in 1780, and it's this often undiscussed legacy which further complicates any heritage narrative of the site. And this is the hotel proposal by the Trevor Osborne Group. So basically what you do is they're proposing to knock 3 of the existing cells into 1 bedroom and ensuite. But that's very expensive to do because it's a Victorian load-bearing masonry structure, and the amount of propping and engineering works required mean that to make it profitable they need a lot of extra floor space. So that's why you get those massive blocks of 4-storey contemporary, not particularly nice, mixed residential and commercial space at the back of the model there. Interestingly, this model is actually a photo taken from the jail, so I was lucky enough to be allowed in, even though the place is pretty much in rack and ruin now. And the model is still sitting there from one of the public consultation days, so it's quite an effective photograph. Armagh Jail has lain derelict since its closure in the mid-1980s, and recently the Trevor Osborne Group have secured all of the necessary statutory consents required to transform the site into a luxury hotel and spa. Construction is ready to commence as soon as the final sums of money can be raised, but the developer at last count said he needed another 2 million more from Stormont, and given that we don't have one of those at the moment, waiting for a while. But of course that's an interesting problem for him as a commercial entity, because the site is currently derelict and falling apart. The longer it sits in the wet and the more winters that go past, the more expensive the repair works will be. And there will come a point where it's no longer financially viable for him to invest his money and the Stormont and local council's money into turning this into a hotel. So this is a critique first and foremost, but it's also a thought-provoking exercise in case he does pull out. What are we going to do with one of this very large and very difficult heritage asset, or one which is very important in our understanding of the Northern Irish Troubles and beyond. Armagh Jail was Northern Ireland's primary women's prison throughout the course of the Troubles. It's commonly viewed, albeit incorrectly, as a place of incarceration primarily for Republican women. It does, however, have a prominent place in the Republican history of the conflict. This is an image of Mairead Farrell during the dirty protests in Armagh Jail. Interestingly, the weird lighting in this photo is because during the protests, the guards boarded up the windows of the cells so that the prisoners couldn't throw their waste out of the window. So the prisoners who were confined to cells for 22 hours a day sat there in perpetual darkness with the mess on the walls. From young women being interned on the site without trial to reported incidents of abuse and enforced strip and cavity searches at the hands of guards and security personnel, to the no work and dirty protests, and even the participation of 3 Republican inmates, Mairead Farrell, Mairead Nugent and Mary Doyle, in the first hunger strike in 1980 in an attempt to reacquire political status. The site does have a significant place in the Republican narrative of the Troubles. And this association in the popular memory has endowed the site with the potential to erupt into political acrimony whenever redevelopment is discussed. One only has to look at the disintegration of the proposals for the Maze Longkesh site and the conflict transformation centre that was proposed there as a warning for how such sites associated with the Troubles can become politically toxic. To the detriment both of society, who have to bear the fallout from a polarising political argument, but also of the heritage assets themselves that decay for want of attention and funding. So that's, we're all familiar with what ended up happening at the Maze. And the Republican domination of the common heritage narrative of Armagh Jail is a clear source of what Silverman refers to as contested heritage, where assets and sites become battlegrounds in a contemporary war over memory, to be exploited or denied to those for whom they hold value. However, as Graham notes, the creation of any heritage actively or potentially disinherits or excludes those who do not subscribe to it, and careful attention must be paid to those narratives lost, ignored, or downplayed. Perhaps the most obvious of these lost heritage narratives in the context of Armagh Jail is the site itself, which is very much seen as subsidiary to the much more infamous prisons of Maze Longkesh and Crumlin Road. This may be partly ascribed to the fact that potentially the future political careers of some of the inmates at Maze and at Crumlin Road, but also because the hunger strike at Armagh didn't result in the fatalities that happened in Maze. But it may also be the fact that the majority of prisoners at Armagh were women, and there's a growing body of literature, as I'm sure we're all aware, that has begun to expose just how underrepresented female narratives are in the heritage and mythos of the Troubles. I wasn't fortunate enough to be here yesterday, but I gathered the Prison's Memory Archive talk was really fascinating, and it's something that I've referred to quite a lot in my own research. This complexity begins to be revealed in oral history projects such as the Prison's Memory Archive, which is being stored here at PRONI, or at least being slowly archived. The wide-ranging interviews with those connected to Armagh Jail and Maze Longkesh were filmed in the very cells and corridors of the prison itself. The prompt to remember provided by these spaces and objects where these memories were initially encoded cannot be understated. Memory recall in these spaces is both performative and spatial. Interviewees move through the site leading the camera crew. They're surprised when seeing the size of their cells, which they remembered as much bigger. They act out with gestures and words their experiences, which are evidently closely linked to the bricks and mortar of the prison itself. Details are revealed which arguably wouldn't have been if the interviews were encoded in a recording studio. These details would then be arguably lost if the site was aggressively redeveloped or demolished. And again, that's another reason why these sites are important to preserve, and why difficult conversations about what use Armagh Jail might have in contemporary Northern Ireland deserve to be had. But the centrality of the Troubles in the narrative about Armagh Jail belies the fact that the site has always been difficult ever since its initial construction. So it's a painting by James Black dating from 1810, which shows the jail in its initial early stages of construction, so it dates from 1780, as I said. And this is a quote from John Howard of Newgate Prison in Dublin, but I think it's relevant here because, for no other reason, the architect of Armagh Jail, the initial architect, was the same. And I'll just read this. It's not kept clean. The pumps are out of order and there's no regular supply of water. There's no proper separation of the sexes from one another, or of petty offenders from the most abandoned criminals. Numbers of unacquitted prisoners are detained for the fees. Such as are condemned to hard labour are confined in idleness. There is no bedding of floors of stone. Spirits and liquors are sold in the prison. Newcomers are robbed or stripped or abused, penny or garnish. The proper prisoners have not the use of the day rooms. The dungeons are used as lodging rooms for prisoners before they are condemned. The sick have no proper rooms or beds. No attention was paid to them, no bath, no divine service. Criminals are made turnkeys. The allowance 2 pennyworth of bread a day is not being delivered, only twice a week. and not fixed by weight, and some of the prisoners are almost starved. Armagh Jail, as a Georgian prison in its earliest inception, was a pretty hellish place to be confined. But Armagh Jail as a Victorian prison in the years following, even after the reforms of Bentham and Elizabeth Fry and the rest, with their emphasis on access to light and heat and sanitation, was nevertheless a cruelly isolating place where prisoners were held in enforced isolation and perpetual silence for periods of years or decades. This is an illustration of Pentonville Prison in London, but you sort of see the prisoners that are covered in face masks, even when they're outside associating with other people in the exercise yards. And it's that enforced anonymity and silence which we now know can be really damaging to mental health. And Armagh Jail was, throughout its history, a site of execution. At least 9 men and women were executed within the prison in the years up to 1904, and their bodies, in accordance with the legislation at the time, were buried in unmarked and unconsecrated graves within the prison grounds itself. And we have no reason to believe that they're not still there. It's something the hotel proposes, or any proposals on the site will have to deal with. Also the fact that we don't even know all of their names. These are some that I've come up with, some just pseudonyms and some nicknames that were reported in the local press, like Lying Phil. All these various threads taken together paint a harrowing picture of the site, one of immense suffering and misery, and also a place whose narratives are plural, divergent, and above all complex. It's one which requires a detailed and sensitive management plan, and there are serious questions which must be asked as to whether a hotel is best placed to deliver this careful curation. There is a real fear that the tragic history of Armagh Jail will be used instead as a gimmick to flog rooms, a form of unique selling point. Whilst this fear may be overblown, the lack of conversation or publicly disclosed information about the narratives which will be presented in the hotel's dedicated interpretation centre doesn't really allay any sort of concern because they haven't published anything. Basically what I'm getting at is, this is Crumlin Road Jail, which many of you will visit this evening to do the tour, and this is Crumlin Road Jail during the height of the Troubles. And these are some images taken from Crumlin Road Jail's website today. And basically the whole thing is, how does this, in 30 years, become this? And is it a good thing? I mean, arguably, removing soldiers from the streets and taking down the reservoir is good, but is this the most appropriate use of the site in contemporary Northern London? Is this doing anything for society beyond bringing in money? Is it helping reconciliation? Of course, proponents of the hotel at Armagh Jail, including the Northern Irish Executive, who backed it to the tune of £4 million already, would point out two key arguments counter to my critique. Firstly, they point out that the province lost out on a huge amount of investment during the Troubles, especially in the tourism sector. But perhaps more pertinently, they would also say, wouldn't you rather see a hotel than a ruin? They present this as a binary choice between commercialisation or dereliction. I reject that binary. I think that it illustrates only a lack of imagination rather than a complete the critique, perhaps better put, is by Sarah McDowell here, the critique of dark tourism. One reading of tourism is that when memory is intended by its reduced to spectacle, it constitutes the simplification and arguably the vulgarisation of remembering the Troubles and all those who lost their lives. Also, other people's sufferings and injustices, the places which lives were taken. This skewed representation of narratives on offer to tourists presents a challenge to peacetime Northern Ireland, where the realities of sectarian conflict have become even more difficult to define. This is something that even the most sensitive museum would really struggle to deal with. But a hotel which has a commercial interest and a vested interest in turning a profit risks oversimplifying the divergent and plural narratives of all of Armagh Jail's history to the point where they're cliched or outright false. And that's a real risk, and that's something that we really do need to discuss as a society moving forward. So just to close, this was my sort of sketched out illustration of what we might do differently. As an architectural critique and in answer to the wouldn't you rather a hotel or a ruin, I proposed an alternative which would basically see the site used for the training of local young people in traditional building skills and crafts, so that it would maintain the site, allow a funding stream to come in, and preserve the site in the medium term, so that it could survive into a future workplace in society, could be more productive and children. And that's drummed up some really interesting conversations which I hope will continue after this evening. And we remain to see what will happen with the site, but I hope I've expressed in somewhat incoherent fashion why I object to the hotel proposal, so thank you.
afternoon, everyone, and welcome back. I'm back to panel 10. Thank you to Gillian and Trina for inviting me to chair the panel, and well done on an amazing conference. Session 10, Engaging with Voices from the Institution. 3 wonderful looking titles coming up. Firstly, we have Gareth Mulvenna. Correct?
Yes.
Gareth is a Belfast-based author and researcher with an expertise on loyalist paramilitaries. In 2016, his book Tartan Gangs and Paramilitaries, The Loyalist Backlash was published and was described by the journalist Ed Maloney as a classic. So we have a classic author about to speak to you today. So hear every word. He currently hosts a podcast entitled Hidden Histories of the Northern Ireland Troubles and is collaborating with Billy Hutchinson on an autobiography of the PUP leader's life in paramilitarism and politics, and I'm sure we'll all await that one. So, floor is yours.
Hi everybody, thanks for coming along. I'm really pleased to be here. It's the first time I've presented this research. Not only have got a lot of people watching, but I've also got the person I interviewed for the research in the audience as well. So no pressure there. So yeah, basically it is what it says. We're going to talk about the Orange Cross movement in terms of loyalist prisoners' welfare and how it was important in the late 60s, primarily early 70s period as being the first of its kind. So basically the sources that I've used are the full archive of the Orange Cross magazine, which Ed Spence kindly lent me. He was the co-founder with his father Billy, and he was the secretary of the Orange Cross movement. Oral history interview with co-founder and secretary Ed Spence, newspaper articles, and general conversations with former loyalist prisoners who are featured in the newspaper and who benefited from the Orange Cross as a welfare organisation. So the aims of this paper are to provide an insight into the first loyalist prisoners' welfare movement of the Troubles. It was born out of a campaign by the Spence family to have Gusty Spence's conviction for the Malvern Street shooting overturned due to a weakness of the case against them, and that's a case that's still ongoing within the family. Record for posterity Ed's lived experience. I mean, his story's crucial, and it puts flesh in the bones of what we already know. We can go into the Lindenhall Library or anywhere else, get the copies of the news sheet and put them away again, but we'll know little about the people who were behind it. A lot of these news sheets disappeared after a short time, but to speak to the person who was integral to putting it together is an absolute privilege, and to have that recorded for posterity is important, I think, for future research. And that audio will complement the documentary and archival sources. And again, it's hopefully to encourage the promotion and preservation of memory, storytelling, and physical materials such as handicrafts in relation to the loyalist prison experience, but also the loyalist experience more broadly, because loyalists and former loyalist combatants haven't been great at coming forward and telling their story or perspective. So that's Gusty as he was in the 1960s. And that's Gusty as he was in 1972 when he gave an interview to David Bolton when he'd been when he was on the run, or he'd been released to attend his daughter's wedding, but he'd been kidnapped by the UVF. So that's basically, you know, the man and the paramilitary, the two sides to Gusty, but he's central to the Orange Cross becoming a movement in the early 1970s. Again, this is a page from the Orange Cross. It's quite a typical page. For the years that it existed as a magazine, for 4 or 5 years, there was a constant campaign to have Gusty Spence's case looked at. And obviously here they've outlined the weaknesses in the case. But why did the Orange Cross start off really, and why did it get that name? It started off basically to reaffirm the Solemn League and Covenant on its 50th anniversary. Ed and his father Billy had set up a stall on the Schenkel to gain signatures at a time when Northern Ireland was beginning to descend into violence, and it was to reaffirm the same principles that people had signed up to all those years ago. And the name came about, Ed told me, because Republicans had the Green Cross, there was a British Red Cross, so they decided on the Orange Cross, which initially led to some confusion about it being an Orange Order organisation, but it was broadly a Loyalist prisoners' welfare organisation. And you can see here there was two main stalls on the Shankill Road and Sandy Row, and the poster here supported the Orange Cross. Visit the stalls. The stalls would have had poetry, handicrafts from the prison, and different types of pamphlet. It was family run. It was run by the Spences and Ernie Scott in Sandy Row. It was, I mean, the whole idea of imprisonment and incarceration was a cultural shift for Loyalists. Some Loyalists had been arrested and jailed in the 1930s, but as young men began to come into the prisons, Armagh, Longcash, McGilligan, Crumlin Road, it became an issue, and a lot of families were affected by either the breadwinners or the sons, and in some cases the daughters as well, being arrested for Loyalist activity. And also the Orange Cross promoted a connection between the prisoners and the community at that stage. So I'm going to play a short clip from the interview with Ed, and as we were talking before we came in here, we did it a couple of years ago, and it's probably not the best quality because we did it in the back room of the Rex, and there was quite a lot of people in that day, so you'll hear a lot of pint glasses and that type of thing. But basically Ed talks about you know, how the stall and the magazine came about.
I'll move on before I expand a bit. With moving the stall, which was actually like a book stall, paper stall, which it was by again on Saturday. But it was only really a day before, a 6x3 piece of plywood with 3 patches with 3 holes on it, just to keep papers in and magazines. That's what we're selling. And then we progressed on to people calling us for nappies and so. And we actually progressed on with a friend who was a judge, made us a 4-wheel, what do you call it? Some you'd see that sells hamburgers and trolleys. It was all covered because we were getting right in all weather, so they're getting soaked and so. So that's on that time in the area I had to run up the standard bar. So there was a risk in there for us, so we really used that every Saturday, and that's how we progressed on the floor. We used to be right by small badges and necklaces and so that, and then with the lads being on cash, they started the leather goods, that was that. But the magazine started up, I had my dad approached John McCaig and asked somebody to print a magazine for him, because we know all around that as such, so they're making money through that. And it was really patent as such.
So I think Ed brought in some of the handicrafts there, if you don't mind showing, or if I can show them. Yeah, basically this is a leather wallet that Gusty did in Longcash for Ed, and this is a belt, Ed Spence, and it's also, he pointed out to me just before we came in, the buckle's Colorado State Penitentiary, so it ties in with the theme of today even more broadly. So the magazine itself, I mean, this is sort of, the picture on the right is the first edition or an early edition. It shows you how sort of DIY it was. And that's the reason behind that is because it was done by the same person behind Loyalist News, which was John McCaig, leader of the Shankill Defence Association. And John, I think, in the early editions of the Orange Cross, John was putting in articles that maybe Billy and Ed weren't so keen on, so they decided to strike out on their own and produce a more professional publication. So this will give you an idea of some of the cartoons that were in it, which spoke to the political situation of the day and also the fears in the Loyalist community about the White Law regime and the IRA being at the negotiating table when Loyalists were feeling that this was, you know, the sort of high noon doomsday scenario, and that the IRA would take over. So you can just have a look at those two cartoons.
Please. No documents will be issued after 4:15 p.m. It would be appreciated if documents no longer required are returned to the issue desk as soon as possible. Thank you for your cooperation.
But aside from those cartoons, which weren't typical of the content, Those were just humorous, speaking to the political situation of the day. This is typical of what the publication was about. And it's got a list of the loyalist prisoners at that stage who were incarcerated. One of the important points to note is it wasn't a UVF publication at this early stage, or it wasn't a UVF welfare movement. It was a loyalist prisoners movement. There was no welfare movement for the UVF or the UDA. It was all loyalist prisoners at that stage. So obviously there's a lot of interesting articles that speak to the idea of special category status that a lot of loyalist women protested for. And there were protests also inside the prison around this period for special category. This is another one I was reading recently when I was getting the paper together for today, and it's made me get blush a wee bit, but it sort of ties in what Ed was trying to do and how the prisoners received what he and his father were doing. Rocky Burns, James Rocky Burns was one of the original 1966 UVF men who was incarcerated on the word of Dandy McLean. And basically, when he came out in 1972, he wrote this fantastic tribute to Ed, talking about how the welfare and the money raised was boosting the morale of loyalist prisoners, and that it says there are radios, sports gear, books, cigarettes, tobacco, toiletries, even cassette players for language classes were distributed around. Boots, bomber jackets, games, and educational facilities were freely given, among many other things. And men who previously were feeling down were now very much feeling up, with a capital U. To us, Ed Spence was something of a godsend. He negotiated with the governor, Major Mullen, on our behalf, and at all times he fought the corner and put the case on behalf of the Ulster Loyalist prisoners. So it goes on. So Ed, talking about the ethos of the Orange Cross, I'll just play this briefly, although I realise I'm running out of time.
I mean, that's what we had we had the policy on this prisoners as well. We were welfare total, nothing else, and we didn't want to distract from that by printing anything that would be detrimental to the welfare of prisoners. There was politics in it, a lot of punishments were well into politics for years. There was always a way to go through politics. There was never any violence mentioned in the Orange Cross. There was never any threats anymore there. We were highlighting things that should have been detrimental to honest people, of course, well. But particularly, as I say, it was more oriented towards for prisoners, and their voice had to be heard last time.
So basically, just to go through quickly, that is a message from inside showing how money was spent in the tuck shop at the time. So they were very good with their accounts, showing how money was spent. It's quite an interesting document from that period. Then obviously the Orange Cross is important in narratives of imprisonment. A lot of the stuff that appears in the Orange Cross would maybe not be in sync with what people think of loyalist prisoners and their attitude to incarceration. Indeed, last night on Twitter somebody couldn't believe that loyalists ever refused to recognise the court in 1972 beyond. So basically there's this feeling that they've been betrayed by their own, inside a living hell, as you can see. And this one Longcash concentration camp, it's very familiar to people who are familiar with the Republican narrative of incarceration. And another one I would like to talk about a wee bit more, the wives of loyalist prisoners. That gives a daily routine of a visit to sons and husbands in Crumlin Road in Longcash. And also, this is an interesting part of the Orange Cross magazine. They put in pen pictures to keep people's names alive and to keep them in the minds of the community, and also to encourage people in the community to write to them. So there you have four people who are quite significant in the story. Ronnie McCulloch, who formed the Red Hand Commando, Geordie Orr, who was one of the people with Gusty Spence in the David Bolton documentary that's famous, Frankie Curry, obviously the nephew of Gusty Spence, and Norman Sayers, who was a brigade staff member. Trevor King, I think that's a fascinating one. People have an idea of Trevor King who know him. You know, there's a famous mural of him as a guy, a much older guy, but this is the Trevor King who was arrested in the early 70s, around the time of Spring Martin. Stevie McRae, Flint McCulloch, asking for people to write to them. Just quickly to round off, two things. The fascinating thing about having access to these sort of newsletters now is it encourages conversation and storytelling. 15 years ago, when Twitter didn't exist and Facebook wasn't really on the go, uploading these sort of things to social media wouldn't have been a phenomenon. But now, I'll give you an example on the right there, Jim Irvin, who was a cage commander. I uploaded this picture to Facebook and he got in touch with me to say he hadn't seen it before, well, not since 1972. And it was a few weeks ago we met up for a cup of tea on the Shankill and he told me a story. So it encourages people who obviously know that you're interested in that whole culture and the narrative. I'll not play this clip, but basically Jim McGee, who was a battalion commander of East Belfast around mid-70s, who was incarcerated in 73, he's just talking here about, he talks about Ed and how brilliant the Orange Cross movement was for prisoners and the importance of the handicrafts. So I'll not play that. And then just to round off, to reiterate what I'm saying, this brings the documentary sources to life by having the oral histories, by talking to the people who were behind the magazine and the movement. It'll provide clarity for future researchers because they won't have to rely on the magazines themselves in isolation, and it opens up new avenues for research, which is something I hope people do on loyalism, and I know there's a few people in here who are currently doing that, so I hope to see more of it in the future. Thank you very much, and sorry for rushing through the end of it there.
Well done, and thank you, Garrett, for being so very disciplined with your timekeeping. We talk about criminality and everything. It feels criminal to cut all the speakers so short, 20 minutes or 15. You know, we could listen to many of you all day. So thank you for that. Dr. Dieter Reinig. Reinisch, I told him I'd mangle his name, but it's not intentional. Is an adjunct professor in international relations at Webster University and a lecturer in history and gender studies at the universities of Vienna and Salzburg. He holds a PhD in history from the European University and is an editorial board member of the Studi Irlandesi, Florence University Press. In October 2019, he will join the Institute for Advanced Study, Central European University, as a junior core fellow. So he's going to talk to us today about uncovering archives combining oral history and private archives in researching Irish Republican prisoners in Portlaoise Prison 1973 to 1985.
Alright, thank you very much for this introduction. As I mentioned in my abstract, despite the recent debate over the use of interviews in researching the Northern Irish Troubles, oral history remains an essential source for scholars researching political violence in Ireland. Nonetheless, little emphasis has been put on the combined use of interviews and archival material in social movement studies. To be sure, historians either focus on the one or the other source category. Hence, in this paper, I'll describe how the combination of interviews and archival research throughout the field research process can uncover archival sources and why I use archival sources to accompany my oral history interviews. To illustrate this combination of two kinds of sources, I will examine the political education of IRA prisoners in the Republic of Ireland during the 1970s and 80s, using the development of the Sinn Féin Cumann, that's a local branch of the party, as a case study. In winter 1985, 3 minute books of this Cumann were removed from the prison and subsequently hidden by a former inmate. Based on this unique source, as well as archival material and in-depth interviews with former IRA inmates of Portlaoise Prison, this paper evaluates the relationship between resistance education of provisional IRA prisoners in the Republic. This paper is structured in 4 parts. It is based on 2 chapters of my PhD thesis that I defended at the European University Institute in June 2018. The title of the thesis is Subjectivity, Political Education and Resistance, an Oral History of Irish Republican Prisoners 1971 to 2000. Hence, the first part of this paper will introduce my overall research and methodology. The second part will introduce my research on Portlaoise based on 2 chapters of this thesis, One of these two chapters is devoted to Sinn Féin Cumann from 1978 to 1986, and this is also the topic of the third part of this paper. This is followed by a final part of the paper, namely what the use of oral history, interviews and archival research show us about the role of court-leash prisoners in the decision-making process of the Provisional Republican movement during the Northern Irish Troubles. My PhD thesis is an oral history project with former IRA prisoners in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. It discusses the relationship between three themes, those of political subjectivity, political education and collective resistance. I examined the evolution of their subjective understandings of self and identity at the intersection of informal education in the prisons and collective resistance. Using the recent conflict in Ireland as a case study, I provide insight into the role of political prisoners in ending armed conflicts and into the personal and political development of radical activists during their imprisonment. I argue that the key to the process of political subjectivity, the becoming of a subject inside and outside the prisons, is political education. It was namely the self-organized lectures and debates that formed the subject politically and strengthened the inmates' identity as prisoners of war. This subjectivity enabled them to stage acts of resistance in defense of their developed identity. In other words, the self-awareness gained through the self-education of young, political, inexperienced subjects empowered individual prisoners to resist as a collective the total institution that was the Irish and British prison system during the Northern Irish Troubles. In a sense, my thesis aims to analyze the role of Republican activists in internment camps and prisons, as well as their interaction with the outside wider Republican movement beyond the high-profile hunger strikes of 1980 and 81. My methodology evolves from the tradition of oral history, influenced by the writings of scholars like Alessandro Botelli and Luisa Passerini. Botelli reminds us that the interviews, as historical source, tell us more about the meaning of an event than the event itself. Accordingly, rather than extracting exact patterns, my oral history approach aims to understand motivational patterns and the memories over time of the narrative. Hence, one crucial consideration in interpreting these interviews is a passage of time that informed the narrative and the events that shaped the memory since the happening of the events remembered in the interviews and the actual recording of the interviews. These events that influenced the interviews may be the mid-1970 ceasefire, the 1981 hunger strikes, the splits of the Republican movement in 1986 and 1997, the 1994 ceasefire, the signing of the Good Friday Agreement, or the decommissioning of the IRA in 2005. Altogether, I interviewed approximately 80 Republicans. In 2010, I interviewed 21 women who were active in Cumann Amman, the Irish Republican Women's Organization, often considered as the women's wing of the Provisional IRA until 1986. These women were active in the Republican movement from the 1940s onwards. Between 2014 and 2017, I interviewed 34 former Irish Republican prisoners from various organizations, such as the Provisional IRA, the Irish National Liberation Army, and dissident Republican organizations. All interview partners were imprisoned at one stage between 1971 and 2010. And in 2015, I interviewed 6 activists of the Irish Republican Youth Organization of Fine Gael, who were still active when I interviewed them, and I'm currently conducting a series of interviews with women in dissident Republican organizations for a book project. In this paper, I will focus on the 34 interviews I conducted for my PhD research. To examine the hunger strikes in 1980 and 81 in the H blocks in particular, and imprisonment of Republicans during the Troubles in general, we need to understand Irish Republican imprisonment throughout the Northern Irish conflict on both sides of the Irish border. While historians like Brian Henley, Patrick Monroe and Gerard O'Fallon have recently published essential contributions to the understanding of provisional republicanism in the Republic during the Troubles, surprisingly, historians have paid relatively little attention to the study of political imprisonment in the Republic during this period. O'Fallon argues that, and I quote, "The Republic of Ireland is perhaps the most overlooked of all the theatres of the conflict during the Troubles," unquote. Sentiments also shared by John McGuire, who researched internment in the Republic before the outbreak of the Troubles. Mary Rogan reminds us that there has been no analysis of political imprisonment in the Republic of Ireland as compared to Northern Ireland. Cormac Behan recently analysed prison protests of ordinary prisoners in the Republic, and notes, and I quote, "While much has been written about resistance by those in prison for politically motivated activities, especially in Northern Ireland, there has been a relatively little examination of protests by ordinary prisoners," unquote. While Byrne is correct in his assessment of the literature on political prisoners in Northern Ireland, my research adds to his analysis of ordinary prisoners by describing political prisoners in the Republic, a subject touched on by Henley in his recent book on the impact of the Troubles south of the border. A comparative approach towards political imprisonment in Northern Ireland and the Republic will broaden the analytic framework of academic research on the Northern Ireland conflict, imprisonment and criminology. My 2 PhD thesis chapters discussing Portlaoise are first a chapter on the prison protests, particularly the hunger strikes between 1973 and 1977, and I argue that they are in fact the prologue to the H-block struggles. The second chapter discusses the Sinn Féin Cumann in prison during the late 1970s until 1985. Since Republican prisons in the Republic of Ireland after 1971 remain a research lacuna, I decided to include additional archival material to my research on Portlaoise. Hence I did extensive research in the National Library of Ireland, working with the Sean O'Mahony papers. A native of County Kerry, Sean O'Mahony has spent his working life in Dublin. Fascinated by Irish history and politics, he has written several articles on various aspects of Irish republicanism and published a book called Frogoch, University of Revolution. This collection is the extensive amount of material he accumulated on Irish republicanism. It spans dozens of boxes. The main focus of his collection is the Republican movement from the Easter Rising in 1916 through the troubles in Northern Ireland to the peace process of the 1990s. There are several boxes with material on Portlaoise, such as newspaper articles, leaflets, but also handwritten notes from the Republican movement and communiques from within the prison, as well as pamphlets and press releases. In the course of my field research, one former prisoner mentioned the existence of 3-minute books of the Sinn Féin Cumann. These minute books were eventually smuggled out of prison after the release of one prisoner who was the secretary of the Cumann at that time. The existence of these minute books have previously been unknown, and they are hidden since the release of this prisoner in winter 1985. After several weeks, he granted me access to these minute books and permitted me to do photocopies of them. In the following part, I will introduce the background and content of these minute books. In August 1973, the first provision Sinn Féin Cumann was established in Mountjoy Prison, Dublin. During an attempt to politicize the provisional IRA prisoners, this Cumann was later reorganized at the meeting of Republican prisoners in 1978. In 1986, 3-minute books of this Cumann were secretly taken from the prison and had since been hidden by the former secretary of the Cumann. These minute books include debates, motions and programs written in both English and Irish. The Sinn Féin Cumann in Portlaoise had a central position in the political and social life of the Republican prisoners during the 1980s. Before the establishment of this Cumann, the focus of the Republican movement was on keeping the prisoners solid Republicans during the sentence, and no effort was made to use the prisoners for political advantage or to include them in internal debates within the outside movement. The situation ultimately changed from the mid-1970s onwards, both in Portlaoise and Long Cash, as we shall see. While the informal political education was unstructured and led by older Republicans with previous internment or imprisonment experience, with the establishment of the Cumann, younger Republicans from the South moved into the position of political leaders in the Cumann. Thus the Cumann not only gave the informal education classes a more structured framework, but became a vital tool for the political subjectivity of younger prisoners. These developments are similar to the generational divide in the northern camps and prisons. The Cumann organized political debates, commemorations and cultural events. However, during the debates that led to the split of the Republican movement in 1986, the outside Republican leadership tried to exploit the Cumann for their own means. These attempts remained largely unsuccessful, and contrary to developments in Northern Ireland, the Portlaoise Sinn Féin members remained largely independent and supportive of abstentionism, while the prisoners in the H blocks were under the control of the outside leadership, and thus most prisoners supported the ending of abstentionism there. In 1986, the majority of the Sinn Féin Irish delegates voted in favour of dropping the policy of abstentionism, as it was called, from the constitution of Sinn Féin. Abstentionism meant that the elected candidates of Sinn Féin would not take their seats in any of the national parliaments in Dublin, Belfast or London, and instead would represent the constituency as delegates of the Second All-Ireland Dáil, established in 1921. The debates surrounding the rejection of abstentionism and the subsequent 1986 split are indeed an important case study that helps us to understand the developments inside prison and the role of prisoners in the outset wider Republican movement, both in the Republic of Ireland and Northern Ireland. Until then, traditional Southern Republicans formed the leadership of the Republican movement from the split between the officials and the provisionals in 1969-70 and the takeover of a new Northern-based leadership in 1983. To be sure, the young Northerners took over the Provisional IRA in 1977-78, and then, over a period of 5 to 6 years, they finally took hold over Sinn Féin as well. The completion of their takeover was in 1983, when Sherry Adams succeeded Ruaidhrí Bródig as president of the party. The Portlaoise Cumann ceased to exist around the time of the 1986 split of the Republican movement. The reasons for the decline and abandoning of the movement remain unclear. Nonetheless, I argue that understanding the Cumann sheds light on the interaction between the Republican prisoners and the Republican movement outside the prison walls. The minute books provide an important window onto the Cumann and Republican prisoners in Portlaoise. The minute books show the date of the meetings and the members in attendance. On the right hand side, this is one page of these minute books. Most parts are in English. Occasionally Irish sections appear that were translated both by the former prisoner who provided me with the minute books and another member of the Republican movement who is an Irish native speaker. To verify as well as receive additional information on the Cumann meetings, interview partners that appeared in the minute books were confronted with material that appears in these books. If contradictions between the narrative and the minute books occur, I noted this by providing both sections in my thesis. To conclude, several observations can be made from these minute books. The prisoner's lecture program was mainly based on Irish history and Sinn Féin policy. However, during the 1980s, international topics gained more relevance. These lectures and debates were led by members of the Cumann who volunteered to hold lectures. To be sure, these volunteers came from a small group of members who thereby established a monopoly on education. The Cumann had strong connections with the outside Republican movement, in particular head office in Dublin and individual Cumann throughout the country, in particular in the counties Cork and Kerry. This resulted in drafting letters, leaflets, policy documents and putting forward motions to the annual Ardesh of Sinn Féin. In other words, the Portlaoise Prison Cumann played an active part in the development of Sinn Féin in the early to mid-1980s. From 1982, the Cumann meetings reflected increasing discussions and unease with the outside movement. This development went parallel with the debates on the electoral strategy of Sinn Féin. Consequently, heated debates on elections and the policy of abstentionism in 82-83 saw a rapid increase of the membership numbers in prison. The overwhelming majority of the Cumann members made their support for the abstentionist policy known in various motions over this period. However, this debate ebbed off in the later years, whereas the same debate continued outside prison and eventually led to the split of the Republican movement in 1986. Thank you.